Matt Taibbi. Welcome to Dad Saves America.
I'm so glad to be here, John. Thank you so much for having me.
So I have been following you for a very long time, and we have a project we're working on together around censorship, and we're going to talk about all of that. We'll start there. But I think the first time I encountered your work had to be during the financial crisis, when you were really on that beat. Just real quick, and we'll come back to your backstory more, but what was the first time you realized you wanted to write? Because I know you started off not in journalism, but maybe even being a screenwriter or a novelist. When did writing as a bug bite you?
So I grew up in a family of journalists. My father is a television reporter. My stepmother was an anchor person and a TV reporter. And I grew up around people who were great talkers. Even my mother, my parents met at a forensic speaking competition when they were in high school. But I'm a terrible talker. And so in that environment, I was very introverted. I knew I was never going to be a television person. And I became very obsessed with reading at an early age and discovered that writing was something I could do, and as opposed to talking. So I always just wanted to be a writer. Later, when I had problems with things like depression, my cure was reading things that made me laugh. So all I ever wanted to do in life was become a comic novelist, basically. But it didn't turn out that way. Journalism is a little orthogonal to novel writing, but it's close.
You've got a sharp style, it's playful. Even when you're tackling serious subjects, you handle them with this playful, I know the term is gonzo journalism in a sense. Do you embrace that? Do you embrace that sense of gonzo journalism? What does that mean?
It's really funny. I was actually once hired to produce an anthology of gonzo journalism.
Really?
Yeah. Somebody wanted me to edit that project at one of the big publishing houses. And I started to put together different things until I realized that gonzo was a term that just basically meant Hunter Thompson. And I called Hunter Thompson. I was a kid. I was in my 20s. And I got him on the phone and I said, look, I've got this project. I'd like you to explain to me what you think gonzo journalism means. And he said, kid, this is a project. How badly do you need the money? And I said, I need it pretty badly. And he said, well, I can't help you. But basically, he was right. I mean, gonzo is just a term in America that means an approach to journalism like Hunter Thompson, who always believed that you should take a novelistic approach to telling stories. He said the best fiction is truer than any journalism. And by that, he meant that people will connect with storytelling more than they will with just the facts. So I do believe in that model. It's just that he actually wasn't one of the earlier people that I read. I was much more into other writers as a young person. So.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation.
I think a theme I'm going to put forward a bit of a table of contents for the viewer/listener, because I think there's so much we can talk about, and I'm going to exploit your time here to its maximum effect. One is, almost at the meta level. We were talking before we started about how hard it is to know what's true. So you live in that world, and for all of us normal people, parents, trying to help our kids navigate the world, navigating it for ourselves, especially now with all these wars and all this crazy stuff, how do you know what's true? How do you navigate that? How do you have a sense of that your beliefs are grounded in something that's not just nonsense or confirmation bias? So that's one big theme. I want to revisit the censorship industrial complex in your work on the Twitter files, because there's been a fresh court case
that nobody heard about.
That's maybe the most important thing from an American perspective, and it's not being covered at all. And then there's a bunch of stories that you have had very interesting and often difficult takes on in recently, including Jeffrey Epstein and the way it's being handled and looked at. All things Russia, and you have personal experience there, and countless others. But let's start with that court case. So what just happened? Lay that out for me.
So before I started working on the Twitter files in late 2022, and before people started hearing a lot about digital censorship, there was a court case filed called Missouri v. Biden. And it was the states of Missouri and Louisiana, along with a series of people, including some very reputable academics, who were suing the Biden administration for essentially interfering with their speech by recommending that they be de-amplified on social media. And that case went from Nowheresville to the Supreme Court in about a year.
Which
or
is
a year.
very fast.
It's extremely fast. It's because of a variety of factors, among other things, helped by the Twitter files amplifying digital censorship as an issue. It made it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sort of split the baby. They decided not to rule on the central issue, kicked it down to the lower courts. It was misreported as a big loss for free speech people. Actually, what they did is they just took a pass on it. But the courts just ruled on it. They gave a big victory to the plaintiffs and basically said that the government cannot interfere with social media, that the First Amendment holds in the same way it always has, even with the internet, which is an incredibly important ruling, but you didn't hear about it in the United States because of the way the news works.
So we had Jay Bhattacharya on the show, and he's one of the
one of the plaintiffs.
One of the plaintiffs. He was the genuine expert, like true world-renowned epidemiologist, public health expert at Stanford, part of the Great Barrington Declaration, basically pointing out that we should protect people who are at risk and otherwise not lock down the society. He was basically giving what was correct and was on all these lists. Some of the things that came out in the Twitter files were that he was put on these various blacklists at Twitter.
It was one of the first things that we found was Jay's name next to a picture that said Trends Blacklist.
So what was happening there? Like just since this case is partly about, like, Jay is Jay maybe the most famous of the plaintiffs in this case?
I would say.
I mean, he's now that
he now
took
is
Fauci's job.
Yeah, and it's important to back up because people may have a skewed understanding of what Jay was doing or saying back then. He did an experiment very early in COVID that proved two things that were very important to public understanding of the crisis. One was that COVID was far more infectious than understood. In other words, any intervention you might think about doing, like keeping kids out of school or putting masks on or doing any of those things, it likely wasn't going to work. He found out that the disease spread far faster than anyone understood. He also found that the death rate was much lower than had been reported, about 100 times lower.
Yes.
Both of those things were suppressed. And as a result, we had huge problems. For instance, the whole debate about whether or not schools should be locked down was massively affected by the suppression of information like this. So what were they doing at Twitter? They were taking all their cues about what information to publish about COVID from the CDC, from the NIH and other government agencies, and these things were being de-amplified, which basically meant that if he couldn't trend, and there were lots of other what they call them bugs. They put like 100 bugs on his thing, and basically nobody saw his research.
I'm trying to conjure the study he did. If I remember correctly, it was in like March or April of 2020.
Right.
And I think what and correct me if I'm misremembering some of this.
Santa Clara.
Yeah, it was Santa Clara, California. He basically, just to recap, the question of how deadly is COVID is a product of a basic fraction. How many people get infected? That's the denominator. And how many people die from it? That's the numerator.
Right.
And that ratio was being treated much higher by an order of magnitude by people like Ferguson out of this imperial model out of the UK. They were just saying millions and millions and millions of people are going to die.
Yeah, we're saying 3.4%. That is a horrific number.
Yeah, that's like the plague type of stuff.
Right.
So then Jay basically said, well, hey, let's just go into a population randomly and see if people have antibodies. And he found something like 15% of the population that he just randomly was testing had antibodies, meaning they had been exposed to it and didn't die. And so that numerator went from 100 to 1,000 or 10,000, meaning instead of 3.4%, it was 0.03%. So
Right.
roughly, I'm fudging. I'm using the numbers as an abstraction, but
You're exactly right. We could have expected that the number of people who would have had antibodies would have been very small. He found that it was enormous,
Yeah.
right, relatively, and that completely changed, our understanding of how deadly the disease was. Right. We later got much more concrete information about it, and eventually the CDC even admitted to all the things that he was saying. But that was much later. Like in this news environment, it's too late. If you don't get it in the first day, it's too late. So,
and just to like round out the what does this mean? Antibodies? What are you talking about? It's like, well, just imagine. Especially, it's interesting because it was in California, which faces east. So imagine you've got businessmen traveling to China, traveling to Japan. They come home, they've got a cold, they're not really sure they just picked up some bug. It rips through their house, then their community, then their kids' school. And before you know it, 15% of your community has been exposed to this thing. That's basically my interpretation of what he was finding.
right.
It was happening probably for 6+ months or longer, maybe even a year. I've met people who basically said, they got hit by a nasty flu in the fall of 2019. And then in retrospect, because they had like the breathing and some of the, they're like, I think I must have gotten COVID. And they had traveled to Asia.
We did stories later about Wuhan and who had some of the first cases there. So it's absolutely plausible that the disease could have been going back and forth to the United States, dating back to the fall of 2019 or even earlier, right? And that shows in the numbers, right? And they escalated very quickly from there. It's also important to point out, Jay didn't care, right? He's a scientist. It doesn't matter to him whether the number is high or low. He's just trying to find out what it is, right? And so it was an absolute shock to him to find that there was resistance to learning what the reality was. And there was tremendous resistance to it.
So what, in the initial filing, what was the claims being made about the role of the government in suppressing Jay and the other plaintiffs? Because one of the things I noticed as I was kind of going back through some of this morning is it's like basically like every conceivable person in the Biden administration across all of its different apparatus were named in this, the Surgeon General, the heads of the things, Mayorkas, all like DHS, all these things, all the alphabets, all of the agencies, very broadly, including like somebody from like the climate advisor. So of course, everybody was in on telling Twitter and Facebook and Google who to shut up. What was the core assertion there in that initial case, which has now been ruled in favor of Dr. Bhattacharya and others?
So they were asserting something that First Amendment scholars would call jawboning, which is when the government doesn't order you to take something down, but strongly suggests, with the implication that they can make life unpleasant for you if you don't agree, right? One of the judges I heard in a colloquy during this case described it as like being like the mafia. Like, boy, you've got a nice university there. Sure would be a shame if something happened to it, right? Like, so job owning is when the government says, we strongly suggest that you take that down or de-amplify that, right? And they were asserting that there was this widespread program within the government to send suggestions to social media companies that they take down or de-amplify certain content. The problem was in their initial complaint, there were a lot of gaps. They didn't really know exactly how all that worked. They knew what happened on the end, which is that certain people got removed or taken down, but they didn't know how it happened. And so that's kind of where I came in, and Michael Schellenberger and some other people. The Twitter files was the middle part, right? And we didn't really know. We weren't really aware of each other, the plaintiffs in that case and the Twitter files reporters, not that much. But it later became very apparent that it was interconnected.
And what has the ruling, because there was an initial ruling that seemed very, very strong before the Supreme Court essentially punted it back. So what was that initial ruling? Because it had strong language in it too. And then where are we today?
So the initial ruling, it was the 4th of July, I believe in 2023 or 2024. And the judge in the case in the lower court was so infuriated by the evidence that had been produced, and by then there had been a lot more evidence, that he issued this sweeping injunction saying that the government could not have any contact with these companies, which was infuriating to the Biden administration. They fought it tooth and nail. And when it got to the Supreme Court, this is what people don't understand. The people think that the plaintiffs lost at the Supreme Court. All that happened was that the injunction was lifted, and it was sent back to the lower court to be fully resolved. Like, in other words, the judge said, before we hear the end of this case, we have to slap an emergency injunction on the government to stop them from doing this anymore. When we're done, we'll issue a final ruling, but this is a temporary, emergency injunction.
And just an injunction is you can't do this.
Cease and desist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Supreme Court says until the final ruling is determined, which we are not in a position to do, you can't have the injunction. You have to basically find the government guilty, and then you can tell them to stop and never do it again.
Right. Now, they've found the government guilty. They haven't enjoined them. They've just basically said, you must follow the law, which they were already breaking, which is kind of a problem, right? So it's a win intellectually. It's a little unsatisfying in the sense that it may not have the practical impact that we would have liked.
And that, so explain what that means. Like, why does a win? So the new ruling that just came out just in the past week says, oh yes, no, they were absolutely violating the First Amendment rights of the plaintiffs,
right?
And doing stuff that the federal government is very clearly, explicitly not allowed to do. Right? Is that fair? Is that a fair summary?
That is absolutely fair, and that's exactly what they said. And what they've said is, you can't do that anymore. The government, however, during the temporary injunction, was barred from any contact with these companies. So now what they'll do is they'll have contact, and they'll say, oh, but we're not making recommendations. We're not telling people not to take content down. And they were already crossing that line before, which is why this is, it's a little worrisome because, they can still break the law now.
One of the things that this is so deep, it's just deeply connected to sort of two different forces. So one is shutting down speech that you don't like, but that seems like it's really just a step towards a bigger goal, which is promoting the narrative you do want people to hear. So how do you think about that? How do you think about what this more broadly has been about? both like with the censorship files, the actions of the federal government, and then the corporate press, which I want to get into because their role in this has been completely bizarre. And they haven't covered this recent court case alone, which is...
It tells you everything you need to know about how the press works in this country now, right? Even 20 years ago, it would have been done completely differently. Somebody would have covered it.
If you're watching this, you already know that free speech is under attack across the West. European governments openly censor content online and will often arrest you for what they deem as hateful speech. And frankly, most of the mainstream media here in the US barely covers it or even talks about it, just like with the Twitter files. Luckily, there's a solution if you want to get the full picture, and it is today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that pulls from thousands of news stories from around the world every day, organizing them by story, showing you bias, reliability, even the ownership of the source. And I have been personally a subscriber to Ground News for years on my own, long before they sponsored the show. Take this story, and chances are you haven't heard about it. In fact, I heard about it on Ground News. The Trump administration is building freedom.gov, a portal designed to bypass digital content bans in Europe and across the globe. The US, in the Trump administration's view, is making free speech a foreign policy priority. Over 85 outlets have covered this story, with 45% of coverage from the right versus just 19% from the left, which should be embarrassing. When we compare headlines, the framing is revealing. Gizmodo, a left-leaning outlet, describes the portal as enabling Europeans to bypass bans on hate speech. In contrast, Welt, a right-leaning outlet, calls it digital freedom against EU censorship. My favorite feature is Blind Spot. It flags stories covered mostly or entirely by one side. You'd be surprised how much you're missing, and it's a perfect way to break out of the echo chamber. Go to ground.news/DSA or scan the QR code for 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. That's the one I've been paying for myself for years. It's just $5 a month, which, as we know, is way less than a cup of coffee today. So subscribe today and stay better informed. And now, back to the video.
You're right about all those bigger questions. Now, I was raised in journalism to think about my job as being very limited, right? In other words, if I was assigned to cover even a story on this scale, I would think about it in terms of my job is to explain to people how this government censorship program works, right? Who contacts whom, what impact do those letters have, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to pull back with this story because the bigger picture is actually more important than the mechanics in this story. The big picture is it's more than about controlling speech. It's more than about suppressing Bhattacharya or, the Hunter Biden laptop store or whatever it is. It's about government having this idea that it has the authority to tell people how to think about everything, right? The other day I was watching a series that I really like called Slow Horses. I don't know if you've seen it, right?
Yeah, it's a good show.
It's a very good show.
I mean, Gary Oldman's just
right,
like a national treasure.
He is.
Not our nation, but still.
It's brilliant, right? But there's a scene in the first season where MI5 basically has cooked up this phony kidnapping of a Muslim kid, basically to make the far right look bad, right, in their country. And there's a scene where she's talking to Gary Oldman. She's like this big hotshot at MI5, and she says, "This is a chance to neutralize the far right." And he says, "Bollocks, it will not." But the underlying presumption that the government has the right and the authority to move people politically one way or the other is unchallenged, and even in a good show, right? and that's what this is about. That there is a widespread consensus, or there was under the Biden administration, that we need to move people in a certain direction, away from certain thoughts towards other thoughts, right? And this is a first step towards something that I would think of as being like a dystopian understanding of of thought control, right? Like it's a complete misunderstanding of the First Amendment and American principles. The Constitution is, I hate to have to get into this, but it's part of what I had to do as a reporter to understand the story. In the United States, we assume that citizens are adults and that they can handle truth and information, right? This is the opposite assumption. This is, we can't let people see certain things. We need them to think a certain way, so they must not see certain materials. And it's a fundamental, like, turning upside down of how we do things in this country. And somewhere that happened in the middle of the 2010s, maybe, and we're still trying to figure that out.
One of the things that I think has gotten hard to find is a notion of being an American that more or less every American, regardless of our radically different politics, backgrounds, religions, races, could all get around and be like, you know what? This is my Americanism. Like, I'm an American. I'm proud to be an American, even though I hate my neighbor.
Right.
Whatever. Even though they're putting up yard signs that make me angry, but we're all Americans. And it feels to me like the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights more broadly, but certainly the First Amendment, is about the most American sort of statement of shared values that we've got. It's like the country was founded and very much by people who were fleeing to be like religious weirdos in the New World. Hence, the protections for practice of religion is right there in the First Amendment. And then to have freedom from this, tyranny. But still, the funny thing is, I talked to this historian, Gordon Wood, and the way he put our lineage was that the British were sort of like radical in Europe for being pro-individual liberty. Mm-hmm. And then Americans were like this second order, even more radical version. Mm-hmm. And that is our founding moment. That is like the DNA of the country's origin was like, no, you can't tell me what to say, think, or do. Leave me alone. Let me hold my beliefs. Let me share them with others. Just keep the French or the Spanish or whoever from invading us, and otherwise leave me alone. Like, do you agree with that? How do you think about like the opportunity to make the First Amendment something that we can all get behind?
Well, we did all get behind it. That's what's so fascinating about this is that something changed, right? I testified in Congress about this with Michael Schellenberger in early 2023. And before I did, I was invited to testify by Jim Jordan, who is a Republican from Ohio. And I was unsure about doing it at first because I grew up kind of in left-leaning America, right? And I was a little worried about the optics of it, which is stupid in retrospect. But I called former members of Congress who I knew who were Democrats, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, what can you tell me about Jim Jordan, right? And basically, they told me, he comes from a time that is now vanished, where Republicans and Democrats basically felt the same way about the freedom of speech, that it was a no-fly zone for everybody, right? Like you could not mess with this stuff, and that it was okay, to go testify before that committee. Now, what's fascinating about that is that we now have a very different America where there are completely different feelings about the freedom of speech, even among people who, age-wise are in the same place as me and grew up, with the same kind of liberal politics. They no longer believe the same things about freedom of speech. It's fascinating to go back and look at movies like The American President by Rob Reiner, right? The late Rob Reiner. Yes. And then that's a very sad story. But if you go back and watch that movie, you'll see this fulminating, passionate declaration about what the freedom of speech is, how it's okay to burn the flag and all this stuff, right? And now those exact same people believe something completely different.
What do they believe from your perspective? Like what is the animating force behind that change?
If you go back historically, I think there were two huge incidents that impacted thinking in Europe and America about speech. In Europe, it was Brexit. And that's not because there's such an overwhelming consensus that Brexit was the wrong way to vote. It's because the powers that be, the people who serve in governments, were so completely appalled that people would vote to overturn their vision of the European community. In America, it was Trump's election, right? When Trump got elected, something fundamental happened in the brains of people who had grown up, listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross and, all the sort of liberal, iconography. They suddenly believe that there are some people who are just cannot be trusted with intellectual autonomy because they will make the wrong decisions. So we have to help them make the right decisions. And that's essentially what this is all about. Which to me is horrifying. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess like at the most basic level, and we're gonna peel this thing back as far as we can within the mass amounts of time we'll spend. These are people who are theoretically tend to be higher IQ, higher credential, more schooling, all that stuff. In a lot of complicated topics, maybe most, what is the right decision? What is correct? You at least have to acknowledge, like, I could be wrong, right? Like the notion that there's a known truth that's not accessible to the rubes, but we know it, and we know it. Like, I guess climate change has had this sort of sloganeering of like the settled science, like this fundamentally anti-science settled science idea seems to be like what that is. Like, oh no, there's a settled opinion that's right, and it never needs to be revisited again.
Right.
Shut up, history of science.
Yeah.
Like, where's that coming from?
Elitism. It's interesting because that your example about climate change is the one that's always brought up when people talk about this transformation that happened in journalism. Right now, we used to in reporting, the way it used to be done and the way my dad did it, and I grew up watching him, was you go out, you ask some questions, you find out some stuff, you try your best to get to what you think happened, you tell the public, then you go home, crack a beer, forget about it, move on to the next thing, right? But somewhere in between, this idea, and by the way, there's some humility involved with that approach, which is, if I'm coming to a subject for the first time today, the best I can do by Wednesday or Thursday is give you a little bit of something that might be true, right? And so you try hard to get it right, but you don't have the arrogance to be absolutely sure, right? Who could be sure in that short amount of time? So it's a job like plumbing or being a janitor. You're just that's why people who were in journalism for a long time, they didn't go to college. They were the sons and daughters of plumbers and carpenters and that sort of thing, because it's not that hard to just find some stuff, give it to people, and forget about it. Now, what they want you to do is to assume this great ideological importance, have a feeling of certainty about what you're doing. The term they use is moral clarity journalism, right? So we must be certain about what we're telling people. We must be absolutely certain about how we want them to think about things. Some of the big proponents of this are reporters like Wesley Lowery, right? Who talks about how we shouldn't include the points of view of police spokespersons in police-involved shootings because they always lie, right? Well, they do lie a lot. I mean, I wrote a couple of books about that subject, but you have to include it, and it's part of the job. The big part of this job is you don't want to be wrong, right? So just put all this stuff out there, just take a step back and let people figure it out themselves. but they don't trust people to figure it out themselves. They want to figure it out for you, and that's why it's changed.
I think there was an interview that went sort of mildly viral or whatever. I don't even know what it means to go viral anymore these days. There used to be this thing in like the 2010s where going viral was like a big deal.
Right.
But there was a clip from Stephen Colbert in an interview in which he described his job, which is to run a comedy show, as essentially like reading all the news and distilling it for the public so that they know how to think. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. But that does seem to be what the job is now seen as. I don't think that started in 2016 though. So or maybe it got supercharged. But like, take me back to, all right, I'm technically a communications major. I went to film school. I remember the journalism people. So you got young people, they're at some crazy college and being taught by people who are, four derivations further to the left than the median American. What are they being taught? Do you have a sense of what's happening there? Like, are the headwaters of journalism as corrupted by this sort of postmodern, the truth is what we think and feel or whatever, as everything else in academia?
I think what you're describing is a very important change just in American culture generally, but let's look at journalism. In the 50s and 60s, if you polled most of the people who worked as reporters in America, they came from working class roots, right? Because it was considered an undignified profession. There was a great
muckrakers and
Walter Winchell once said, I'm a reporter, but don't tell my mother. She still thinks I'm a piano player in a house, right? That was kind of the way it was thought of back then. But after All the President's Men, being a journalist suddenly became a very sexy thing with upper class people, right? And I know this because I was one of them. I went to an overpriced liberal arts school, Bard College in New York, and what do they teach in journalism school? First of all, you don't need to go to journalism school, unfortunately. I say that with all affection for people who work as journalism professors, but you can learn the job in like a day and a half. What they teach you, though, mostly in places like the Columbia Journalism School, is a series of elite assumptions, right? What kinds of sources are good sources, what kinds of sources are bad sources, how you get information, how you assess the veracity of things. Old school reporters who spent most of their time on the street or interviewing real people, they would see through most of what they're taught, what you would teach in a big journalism school. But a lot of these kids don't, right? They come out of these schools and they're packed full of silly academic ideas, and that was already bad. That was the kind of thing that was described by people like Noam Chomsky in the late 80s. But there was an additional thing that happened in this century that had to do with kind of a uniformity of thought, the transformation of journalism from a fact-finding job to a fully ideological job. Like if you hung out in a newsroom in 2005, it was like a comedy club. People joked around. Nobody cared what your politics were, right? Like it wasn't even discussed. Now, if you have the wrong view about anything, you're out. Like there will be an HR complaint against you.
We've seen that. We saw that with the pushing out of Barry Weiss and others from the New York Times and all kinds. There's countless stories along those lines.
And several of them ended up being Twitter Files reporters, oddly enough. But yeah, absolutely right. And it's become something else. It's become government propaganda. And part of the reason I know this is because I lived in Russia. I worked in the Pravda building. And in the 90s, as a foreign correspondent, I got to know all those people who actually did government propaganda for a living at newspapers. And it's indistinguishable from what goes on in American journalism now.
That's a great segue into that backstory, because there is the All the President's Men. I rewatched that movie in the past year. And this is Watergate. This is the backdrop of the Vietnam War. So you have this thing that we've come to be told was like the best part of the American left that's connected to the civil rights movement. Oh, you had this like 60s civil rights movement, free speech on college campuses, being opposed to the Vietnam War, which is this horrendous meat grinder. And then like Nixon is corrupt and the great journalists like expose it. All of that is essentially the press being like the fifth estate or the fourth
estate?
Fourth
Yeah.
estate.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting fifth column and fourth estate
exactly.
combined in my head. But so you got the fourth estate.
Yeah.
Opposing power.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can I scoop to get bad guys in the government fired is exciting.
Oh, it's thrilling if you're a young person. The optics of that, right? Like, I can be a guy in a corduroy sports coat who gets Nixon out of the White House. That's amazing. Just by being kind of like a private detective who works in a newsroom. Like, how cool is that? That's amazing, right? But it was a little flawed in its understanding of what journalism is supposed to be, and I think a lot of people took it to mean they were paying more attention to the politics of the situation than the mechanics of what the job is, right? Which is what I took out of it, which is that this is really cool the way they do this stuff, right? Like, the phone calls, the going to the library, like that sounds like a lot of fun, like, but yeah.
So you have this moment now where the so-called professionals in the like corporate press, the like well-established media brands, maybe they oppose politics when Republicans in office, but in general, there's like a broader towing the line of the government, right? Is that a fair way to see what the mainstream, whatever you want to call it, of the press has become? It certainly feels like it in response to the Twitter files.
Yeah, and the press had already become identified in the public's mind long before the Twitter files. They had become seen as basically tools of the American elite. I think the worst images there are like the correspondence dinner, right? Where you see all these people who are supposedly like gritty, hard-edged reporters, and they're wearing tuxedos, and they've got, Hollywood actresses on their arm, and they're laughing at unfunny jokes by every president, right? And that's what people see, and then they put two and two together, and they think, well, those same people are also telling us lies about things like the Iraq War, right? Later on, Russiagate, and so they're not really truth tellers; they're courtiers. They are people who sit at the side of people in power, and they help them spread a message. Now, with the Twitter files, it was very graphic that the people in the media, the so-called corporate media, they didn't even look at the material that we put out. They just spent all their time assassinating the characters of people like me and Michael Schellenberger and Barry Weiss, which is what you would expect from, a propaganda organ, not from journalists.
From stooges, from like basically mercenaries for the state.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
So that brings us to your time in Russia. So how did you end up in Russia? When were you there? Like, paint the picture of this time in Russia.
Yeah. So as a young person, my favorite writers were all Russians. Russians have incredible, great, funny novelists, and they were all my heroes. And I wanted to learn to read Russian, so I could read those books in the original. As a student,
what were some of the favorite authors and books?
So Nikolai Gogol is a writer who's not very well known in America. He's extremely funny. He's sort of an absurdist. Bulgakov, who wrote The Master and Margarita, is another fairly well-known writer here. But I also love Tolstoy, Chekhov, all those writers. Yeah. So anyway, I went over there. It was still the Soviet Union. I was a student actually at a Soviet university in 1989, 1990. I had to take scientific communism as a course, but that was really just so I could do the language part, right? And
what was that course like?
It was completely nuts, right? They just lied to us one after another about things. Like, if you know anything about Russian history, there's an episode called the Kronstadt Rebellion, where Trotsky massacred about 1,400 sailors right there in the city where I was studying, St. Petersburg. And they gave us an old textbook from the 1930s that basically blamed it on the sailors, right? Like, and I knew this history. Like, I was reading it. I'm like, this is ridiculous. But, the lingual education was very good. Russians are very literate people, and they have very good teachers. And so I learned Russian very quickly. And when I graduated, I just decided to stay, thinking essentially that I would start, I wanted to be a writer over there, but I had to pay the bills. So I started doing my dad's job and reporting. And while I was there, it was a very tumultuous time in Russian history. And I got to learn under these incredible investigative reporters. There was a period between the 1991 revolution and Putin taking power where there was this amazing flowering of investigative journalism in Russia, just for a very brief period. And these people risked their lives every time they reported on anything. Incredibly brave. I got to know a lot of them. Some of them are dead now. But they taught me how to do this work, right? And
how did that happen? Just so it's 1989. It's into the early 90s. The wall comes down in 91. Am I remembering that correctly? So is it Boris Yeltsin? When is Boris Yeltsin?
Yeltsin was the first president.
Yeah, so he's the first president. There's this moment where it's like, the end of history. Okay, communism obviously just literally failed. It's failed everywhere it's been tried. But it really spectacularly fails to such an extent that they're like, we're on board. Hey, here we are. We're ready to join modern civilization. But that society was living under that boot for so long. How did these people that you're talking about, how did they not lose themselves? How did you even have a moment from a kind of remnant culture of being a journalist or being skeptical and willing to stick your neck out when, at any given time, they're killing millions of people for doing that?
It's incredible, and it's distressing to think about it in comparison with America, where we don't have as much of a flowering. I mean, I think your show is an example of how we do have some intellectual underculture in this country, right? We are trying to keep.
I'll embrace being part of the intellectual underculture.
Well, I mean, no, not underculture. That's the wrong word.
Oh, it's fair.
Counterculture, right?
Yeah.
But the Russians, even during the worst peak periods of the Soviet Union, they never took the stuff seriously. The bulk of people were passing around what they call samizdat, which means self-published work, and they were nourishing this very rich intellectual culture, outside of the scope of all the big institutions. And so when the wall fell down, and suddenly they said, you can have a free press, there were people who were ready to do it. They were ready to go, right? Like there were gung-ho, great writers who had just enormous balls who were ready to take on everybody. And look, it was very dangerous. There was a guy at a paper called Moskovsky Komsomolets who was writing about corruption in the defense ministry. And one of Yeltsin's favorite ministers was this guy, Pavel Grachev. He was the defense minister. And the reporter who was digging all this stuff up, he opened his briefcase one day and it just exploded, and his head blew off in the newsroom, right? Or I think it was in a train station. But that was what happened to people there. Like, if you reported about corruption, you got shot in the head. I mean, the Russians are really good at finding creatively horrible ways to kill people. They found all of them in the 90s, and I was fascinated by the work they were doing, and I started to hang around with some of them, and I was fortunate to learn a little bit about what they were doing at the time.
So you had said earlier that you had basically a front row seat to state propaganda, and alluded to it, what we see today in America, quacking like that duck.
Yeah, I mean, I as I said, I worked in the Pravda building. I was at the Moscow Times, which was a Western paper, but one floor up was Komsomolskaya Pravda, which was once the world's largest newspaper, and it was full of old Soviet apparatchiks. I used to go up there and just chat with those folks, and they would tell me they would get their talking points in the morning about politically what they were supposed to say, and they would just hammer it out and go home and then go fishing on the weekends. And but that same kind of just complete craven supplication to power, intellectual lack of pride, right? Like, you have to be so completely dishonest with yourself to put out somebody else's ideas day after day after day. That's what's going on in the media today, right? It's people they're in the same place intellectually. Their ideas are predetermined, and that doesn't bother them. And, God help them, because I think that there's a karmic blowback for this stuff, right? And that journalists have a responsibility to be honest, not just for the public's sake, but for the sake of our own souls, right? You want to be able to sleep at night, and I don't understand people who do it the other way, but they do.
When did you come back to the States?
In 2003.
Wow. So you come back. So you were in Russia for 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What was that like?
It was amazing. Russian state television reported for quite a while that we shot down the plane in Shanksville, which I thought was interesting, because I don't think they were trying to say anything negative about the United States. I think that's just what they were getting from the Defense Department, right? So that's interesting. But the Russians were very, they were unsympathetic to us about the Bush v. Gore fiasco. They had spent so long being laughed at by the Americans for their dysfunctional state that when we had problems, they thought that was very funny. But they were on our side about 9/11, right? Like, they had
Poot.
Yeah, they had their own problems with terrorism. I mean, I saw a couple of those things. Like, there were blasts in the middle of Moscow, so they were with us, and it just. But what happened in Russia, it was kind of a precursor to what's going on in America, which is that there was this tremendous dissatisfaction with the sort of globalism, the plans that the WEF and the World Bank had for Russia. That was disastrous for them, and they turned to a more authoritarian solution, because and a more nationalist solution, which was eminently predictable. And I think some of those things are happening here in the States too, because ultimately people, you have to make a decision. Do we want to have a country or not? And I see a lot of similarities, I guess what I'm trying to say.
my first encounter with your writing was during that post-financial crisis where I was gorging myself on economics and finance to the best of my ability. And I remember that in the late 90s, this is a vague memory, but in the late 90s, there was a Russian financial crisis that actually rippled back to the States and actually, I think it was the late 90s.
Yeah.
And that played a role. There was
A bailout.
long-term capital management. Am I remembering that right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Long-term capital management was one of the signature moments on our road to a permanent bailout state, right?
Yeah. So just briefly recap that what that was, because it's like I'm laying the groundwork here because Russia is like the underlying architecture of so much, like our relationship and what we're told about Russia and what Russia does has seemingly just been the architecture for everything going on in American governance for like the past 15 years. So you have it's late 90s, the wall came down, there's this like freewheeling opportunity to maybe have Russia now be like a good guy, what was it? There was
Jeffrey Sachs.
Yeah,
Shock therapy.
Jeffrey. I have all kinds of mixed feelings about Jeffrey Sachs, but on all kinds of angles. But yeah, so you have this idea of okay, we're going to get them into a more free market situation. We're going to have foreign investment flow in. What happens in the late 90s with long-term capital management? Because I think sometimes these crises lead to political change that's really bad and is like the actual scars of the crisis.
So the actual mechanics of long-term capital management, I don't remember all that well. I mean, I do remember it was a hedge fund that was overinvested in emerging markets, right? And Russia was one of what they call BRIC countries, right? They're the emerging big foreign markets that weren't sort of traditionally part of the Western structure. So Brazil, Russia, India, right?
Yeah. All the sort of formerly Soviet-facing countries.
Exactly. Now, the problem with Russia was that all of the journalists who were there had been sending home all this Pollyanna reporting about how great things were and how fantastically the experiment towards free market capitalism had been going. In fact, there was almost no free market capitalism in Russia. Like everything was essentially, they called it prihvatizatsiya, which is grabitization. And that basically meant that money came from the government. It flowed directly to oligarchs, who basically stole national wealth, liquidated it, sent it overseas, right? So you had a ton of capital flight out of Russia, and then when Russians asked for American or Western loans as bailout money to stem the tide and help stabilize their economy, they stole that too. Right, like the Russians are amazing at stealing things. Like there are tons of stories about the brilliance of their financial scamming. But one of the things they did, there were people inside the Russian government who were actually front-running, insider trading their own national treasury bills. And so that and a bunch of other scandals came to a head at sort of the same moment, collapsing the Russian economy, causing all of these hedge funds that invested in emerging markets to fail. And rather than letting those people fail, a lot of those people in America were very well connected. It was decided that they had to be bailed out. Now, looking back, I don't understand why they need to be bailed out. When people perform badly economically, the main regulatory feature of capitalism is allowing failure to fail.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. It's profit and loss is actually just as important.
Right? Isn't it?
It's not profit and then you lose. It's I win, you lose. That's just socialized. That's just socialism light.
Yeah, and it was socialism. Initially, it was socialism for the very rich, which I don't understand, right? So there was an early moment under Clinton where a bunch of currency speculators in Mexico got in trouble, right? And they lost their shirts and came weeping to Clinton and said, we need to be bailed out because, the stability of capitalism is at stake. In fact, it was just their, Hamptons houses that were at stake. They got bailed out. Then long-term capital management came in 98. That wasn't so much public money, but it was publicly organized, that bailout. And
I've read some people suggest, and this might be overly simplistic, that the Fed, because there was a flash crash in 80, or am I remembering this? Was there? I'm getting one thing confused. 87, but like jumping ahead. That was this different Fed shenanigans.
Mm-hmm.
People I've read suggest that the Fed easing money against the backdrop of long-term capital management actually played a role in like accelerating the dot-com boom and bust.
Oh, 100%.
Because that's a story that almost nobody ever hears about, the dot-com boom and bust. It's all just like, oh, Amazon and Pets.com and everybody went crazy. It's like, yeah, people were going crazy, but then you had like the money printer going on overdrive to stabilize this crazy Russia foreign investment currency nonsense deal.
Right. People don't understand how the Fed works. They don't understand any of that stuff. So when the money supply expands, it's got to go somewhere, right? And, the stock market was doing very well at the moment. The chairman of the Federal Reserve was telling us we were in a new paradigm.
Yeah, Alan Greenspan.
Yeah, you didn't have to look at things like profit and loss statements anymore. Now you could somebody could scribble on the back of a napkin that, whatever.com was going to succeed, and that was a safe investment. So people poured all their, federally allocated funds into these instruments, which got overinflated. And what always happens in bubble economics is the people who are first to get out get rich, and then all the ordinary people get hammered in the end, right? And
it's a Ponzi scheme.
It's a Ponzi scheme. That's the original Ponzi scheme. That's how it works, right? Like you take the new money to pay off the original investors, right? But there's never any real, any real growth. So that happened with .com, and then it happened with mortgages.
Yeah,
and that's what I covered.
So you've got Western enthusiasm for Russia being no longer communist, and a bunch of storytelling about how great everything's going. But underneath the surface, it's a griftocracy. It's oligarchs. It's, building like a Western civilization is actually really hard and takes real long. And, you don't just invite Jeffrey Sachs and Joe Stiglitz in to architect your society and have any of that work.
Right.
Out of that morass and booms and busts and disaster emerges Vladimir Putin. So you come back to the States in 2003. How are you looking at and thinking about who Vladimir Putin is, what he represents, having lived in Russia at a formative time in your life? Like how did you understand who he was, what he was?
So I'm probably one of the only Americans who knew who Putin was when he was a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg when I lived there. I had been a student at the university, at Leningrad Technical University. He was just starting in government back then. He was the deputy to a politician who Americans loved, named Anatoly Sobchak, who was often described as the Russian Jefferson because he had written the new Russian Constitution. Putin was his deputy, right? Now, in reality, Sobchak was extremely corrupt, right? And Putin, let's just say he had a very specialized role in let's say, managing the proceeds of certain transactions, right, for this Sobchak person. When Sobchak got in trouble, and it looked like he was going to be indicted, Putin arranged, because he was a former KGB guy, he arranged for his safe passage out of the country. And Sobchak never got prosecuted, managed to escape, I think to France. I can't remember where exactly. But you'll find this in Boris Yeltsin's autobiography, which he didn't actually write, but whatever. Yeltsin was impressed by that moment because Yeltsin himself was in trouble at the end of his term.
He was like, ooh,
Yeah.
Putin could help me.
Exactly. And he says it outright in the book, in one of his books, that, this Putin guy was really great in that episode, and I could use somebody like that on my team. And he brought in Putin essentially to guarantee his safe passage out of power at the end of his life. And so none of us in Russia had any illusions about what Putin was. We all knew he was a hardcore KGB thug, right? And one of the first things he did was blackmail the prosecutor general, right? By publishing a sex tape of him romping around with prostitutes. It was on national television. It was disgusting. I remember watching it. But then he was famous for, he went on television and talked about how he was going to be different with the Chechens, right? Like, no more pussyfooting around, no more just dropping vacuum bombs on Grozny. We're going to go kill all of them. And there's a famous clip where he says, that's it. There are no more questions. If you're in the outhouse, we'll whack you in the outhouse. Right? He used the word whack like a mobster. Russians loved it. Right? They were like, this guy's tough. And that was the backdrop of Putin's rise. He was, Yeltsin was seen as a very weak figure. Drunk all the time, embarrassing. Putin was in control, well-spoken. If you go back and look, you'll find a scene where he speaks in front of the German parliament in German, right? And you can see all the German politicians starting to get a little aroused, right? Because it reminds them of something.
Oh boy. Yeah.
And so he was exactly as advertised. But the thing that was really tough from my perspective is that Putin correctly, sadly, identified the fact that there was a thriving investigative journalism community, and he couldn't have that. And so rather than just sporadically having them murdered the way things were done previously, it was done systematically. And so by 2000, 2001, a lot of those folks that I was talking about started to get killed or beaten or whatever. And so that's how I thought about Vladimir Putin. I thought of him, he did do something for Russia that I think was positive. It's going to sound crazy. He went to all the oligarchs and he said, you know what? There's a new sheriff in town, and I'm going to let you keep doing what you're doing, but you got to keep the money in Russia, right? No more sending it out to villas in the south of France. No more buying yourselves yachts endlessly. You got to keep profits in this country. And so Russia became a rich country, right? Like, it's much better off than it was before. Like, now, is that good or bad? I don't know, but it's the truth. And it's one of the reasons why people who go to visit Moscow now don't say it looks like the 1930s Chicago, which is what it looked like to me. They say it looks like Tokyo, right? So
this is a question that you've already functionally answered in your description, but how do you respond to people who, especially people in the corporate press, who are, the various 20-something strivers that went to some stupid school and got their heads filled with mush and then only read like 4 things before tweeting about their moral clarity, see that you were in Russia and now you seem to not think that Trump is a total Russian stooge. Therefore, you are somehow like a Russian agent. Like, how have you confronted first of all, has that happened to you? I imagine it has. I think I've seen it said, but how have you had your history with Russia been weaponized against you?
Yeah, people say that all the time that I'm some kind of agent of Russian influence, which is it's hilarious on like 19 different levels, among other things, because I actually have friends who died under the Putin regime, right? Like,
right. It's more visceral for you than them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's one of the reasons I see free speech as such a life or death issue in the United States, is because I saw what happened when it ended over there, right? And my newspaper that I had in Russia was shut down by the Putin regime. I had left by then, but we had already begun to have problems. And I was extremely critical of Putin when I was there. One of the dumb things that I did when I was a young person is that I wiretapped his chief of staff.
Wait. You wiretapped Putin's chief of staff. So first of all, just mechanically, what does that mean? Like, how did that happen? Little detour here. This is a crazy story.
It is, yeah. If you look, you will see that I worked with a newspaper called Stringer, which was a Russian newspaper, and that we wiretapped a guy named Alexander Voloshin, who was Putin's chief of staff at the time.
And what literally did that actually mean, to wiretap? Do you technically know what that meant? Because I don't really think I know what it means. I know what it means in the movie sense, but
it means that one of my Russian colleagues had a friend who was in a position to wiretap people, right? Or had previously occupied such a position.
So could get access to the phone calls and record them without being known.
So we got a CD with two weeks of taped conversations of everything that went to this guy, and I published it.
You published it while you were there.
So I wish I could say I was brave enough to do that. I put it to bed, flew out of America, waited to see what happened to the Russians who had published it, because we had partners in Russia.
Flew out to America?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When nothing happened to them, I thought, all right, it's safe. I can come back, right? And I came back. I flew back to Russia, and through an extraordinarily stupid coincidence, something had happened to the lamination of my passport, and so I was detained when I came back. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm going to be in jail for the rest of my life here, in the best case scenario, right?
Right.
But it turned out to be just a technical glitch. But yeah, no, we did that, and there was lots of stuff on there that was damaging. A lot of it was just things like, all right, which person who's a friend of, this connected politician can we give a dacha to? Who can we give a stake in this company to? Like, it was stuff like that, right? It was fascinating stuff, but I was no friend of Putin. We were really rough on him when I was there, and I was terrified of him. But I don't, that it doesn't follow that Donald Trump is an agent of Vladimir Putin just because Putin is not the best guy in the world, right? So people who think like that, I don't understand that.
I'm going to skip past the financial crisis, because we could spend literally 3 hours talking about that, and it's not as important for where we're heading or where I want to go together. But you get back 2003, Iraq War. When did you start at Rolling Stone?
2004.
And then did you come into Hunter S. Thompson's? You actually sat at his desk, right?
Well, I had his job. I was the campaign reporter. One of the editors at Rolling Stone had seen my writing while I was in Russia. And when I came back, they asked me to come in, cover the campaign. And this is one of the iconic jobs in American journalism. And it was great fun. And it was a great place to be initially.
what was it like having like years before, like reached out to him trying to ask this question of like, what is gonzo journalism, to now have his job? That just must have felt like surreal.
It was very surreal. And I also worked, like Hunter, I worked with an illustrator, right? So they even brought back that tradition. Hunter famously worked with a guy named Ralph Steadman. I worked with a guy named Victor Juhas, who had a similarly satirical style.
Yeah.
Great illustrator. And it was intimidating, I will say. But the thing is, Hunter had this unique, I think, sort of born talent to take nonfiction writing and add a quality to it that was artistic and sort of five-dimensional. I don't even know how to explain it, but the one thing I think was smart to do is that I didn't try to do that as much. There will be some embarrassing passages if you go back and look where you can see I'm trying to rip him off a little bit. But I was always much more of like a traditional explanatory reporter. And I try to do that more, or to do things more in the style of somebody like H.L. Mencken. So
I love H.L. Mencken.
yeah, he was great. He was like Thompson was doing something much more radical and difficult, and so I didn't try to do that.
One of my favorite quotes from Mencken is, democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard.
Good and hard, exactly.
I'm pretty sure we've all been getting it good and hard along a lot of dimensions. Okay. Financial crisis ushers in the Obama White House. And Hillary Clinton, who spent her primary time trying to call him all manner of heinous things, ends up entering Secretary of State. And you have this moment. There's a couple moments in early Obama as it pertains to Russia and as it pertains to all the way coming up to the present day that in revisiting, I just want to revisit with you. You have Barack Obama whispering to Dmitry Medvedev about how after the 2012 election, he'll have flexibility to do something. I don't know what. And Hillary having this Russian reset plastic button press moment that, of course, that the Russians that they mock right in front of her, and they're like, "Oh, the buttons got the wrong name."
Yeah, she mistranslated that, or somebody did.
But you have this thing that I don't know if you'd call it détente or trying to be friendly or alliance or something. But early at least the first term of Obama, you have that moment. What is going on there? What is that moment? What is the state of the relations between early Obama, U.S., and Russia?
As I understand it, and it wasn't something where I was there and I was, getting the inside scoop all the time. Putin during the Bush years had at least a functional security relationship with Bush. I think Barack Obama himself was more pragmatic, right, and saw Russia as, not an ally exactly, but someone with whom we can do business, right? That was sort of, I think, the idea with Putin, and so turning the other way when Putin walked into the Crimea, I think that smells of Barack Obama to me, but. Hillary Clinton, and there was a whole other wing within the Obama government, was developing this other theory, right? And this was consistent with some other things that had happened dating back to the early 90s, was thinking in terms of this constant expansion of NATO, right? And with Ukraine as maybe the ultimate prize at the end there. And I think if you had gone back in time and asked Russia experts, is that a good idea? They would have said Russia will never accept Ukraine as part of NATO, right? Like they will go to war over that, right? And so that's what I saw happening in the second part of Obama's presidency, that there was a stepping up of this idea that we had to expand NATO, that America's presence in Ukraine had to be redoubled, and that we had to more openly signal opposition to Russian influence in the region.
In the debates between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, there's a moment where Romney was very hawkish on Russia, thought Russia was a serious geopolitical threat to the United States. And Obama says something to the effect of, I'm going to closely but still paraphrase, the 80s they want their Cold War politics back, something like that.
Yeah,
it was
they
like
want their
this
foreign policy back. Yeah.
It's like there was a totally dismissive. It was like, didn't you see Austin Powers? We're friends now, dude. Like that was basically the vibe of Obama at that moment in 2012.
Even Rachel Maddow was mocking Romney, and she paraphrased Obama by saying, Russia is no longer a serious enemy. They're a gnat on the butt of an elephant, is the way she put it. So that's where people's heads were at just a couple of years before Russiagate.
So then there's a couple things that happen that we don't need to dive deeply into, but that are there. I see them all very deeply connected to the like derangement that has taken place. The annexing of Crimea, is that 2014?
Yeah, I think it was 2014.
That's Russia saying, "Hey, it's a peninsula, isn't it?" I'm trying to visualize the map in my head. Oh, this is important. This is ours. We're taking it, and they succeed in doing that, and they've taken it functionally from Ukraine.
From Ukraine,
yeah.
And Obama turned his head on that one. Right now, this is an area where I get very frustrated talking to Americans about, because people who have not been there don't know the history, don't know that Crimea was basically always Russian, right? If you go to Ukraine, on one side of it, if you can't speak Ukrainian, you can't get around, right? Like that's on the Polish side. On the other side of it, everybody speaks Russian, basically is ethnically Russian, right? And that's because Ukraine has a very complicated history. Its maps have been redrawn a million times. Crimea, was traditionally like the vacation home of the Russian nobility, and even there was a vote there for whether or not people wanted to be part of Russia, and Russia won. Now, was that vote legitimate? I don't know, but I think it's possible that people would actually vote that way, having been there. There is
a book by Rick Stengel called Information Wars, which I read. We will come back to him in our conversation, but just to overlay his perspective, which is very much the censorship industrial complex super monster perspective, was 2014, and that Crimea vote was like the testing out Russian interference in an election through hybrid warfare propaganda. That's a story he tells in that book. How valid is that, do you think? Hard to say, hard to know?
It's hard to say, hard to know. It's possible that the whole thing was concocted. It's possible they lied about it. It's possible they interfered with the results. But again, having been to the Crimea, I would say that it's not unreasonable that that vote would have turned out that way. Now, if you ask me about other parts of Ukraine, I would say something completely different. Even the other territories that are disputed now, like Luhansk and all those places, it's a little different, right? But the Crimea is almost entirely Russian. So they may have felt better under Ukrainian rule, but What's frustrating about Stengel is that he's writing from the perspective of somebody who only knows what he's read in briefings and things like that. So
he was the former. He's basically like the Walter Lippmann of our time, although that's giving him too much credit.
Right. Yeah. Well, Lippmann was a colossus intellectually compared to Stengel. But go ahead.
Yeah. So around that same time. And dear listener, this is all super important. If you want to understand the landscape of the things that you've heard for the past 10 years, it's super important. Around that same time, you have Zelensky and this, is it the Maidan coup? There's the moment where Ukrainian leadership changes hands, and the U.S. is at the table. Victoria Nuland, recount that moment, because this all plays into the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, I don't think it was Zelensky who was.
He wasn't the president at the time.
Not at the time, but basically there was a moment where there was a sort of pro-Russian president in Ukraine, Yanukovych. Right? Was it Yanukovych?
Yeah, Yanukovych.
Yeah, Yanukovych. He was being opposed by the United States. And there was also a considerable amount of controversy over an economic deal that was being worked out, whether Ukraine would essentially remain in Russia's orbit as a trade partner or whether it would kind of permanently be in Europe's orbit. And Ukrainian leadership kind of changed its mind a couple of times, and we didn't particularly like that. There was an election result that didn't go our way, right? And then there was this thing they call the Maidan coup, right, where there were, demonstrations in the streets and calls for Yanukovych to step down, and subsequently, I think it's fairly well established that we had a pretty strong hand in instigating that. It was sort of like the prototypical example of what we would call a color revolution, right?
There's these recordings of, she was in the State Department.
Nuland,
yeah, Victoria Nuland basically opining of who should lead Ukraine with the sound of authority, like it was our decision to make.
Yeah, so somebody wanted, I believe it was Jeffrey Pratt, who was like an ambassador, I think, or he worked in the State Department there, who was suggesting the boxer Vladimir Klitschko as somebody who might rise.
We could do a boxer, we could do a comedian, we got all kinds of like wacky characters we could put in.
Yeah, and it's so weird to listen to these people talk. Like, they don't know how they sound. Like, yeah, we're just going to sort of casually decide who gets to run this country, right, after they've already had a democratic vote, which we've helped overturn. And she's like, no, we don't want Klitschko. Like, Yats is our guy. She's talking about this guy, Arseniy Yatsenuk, right? And so that's on tape, right? Like, here's the United States just basically saying, yeah, no, this is better, right? And, that stuff all happened, right? And there's a reason why, I hate to do this, but Americans have to imagine what it would be like if recordings came out where Russians decided who got to be in charge of the Mexican government, right? Like, I think we probably wouldn't take it too well, right? And that's kind of how it went in Russia. There was also tremendous paranoia. People have to understand that Russians had been invaded by Western powers repeatedly to disastrous effect. Yeah. Over and over in their history. I mean, I'm talking about a disaster on scales that Americans can't undernd, like, losing
Napoleon, Hitler, big guys.
They were, they lost 20 million men in World War II, right? There was a deficit of men even when I got there 2 generations later, right? Like, women had trouble finding men to marry because of the scale of, the death.
Is this where the Russian bride market emerged out of the death toll of World War II?
Partly, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And
hadn't really thought about that until just now. That's really crazy.
And so part of part of what's going on in the Russian imagination also is what happened with Ukraine, right? Like Ukraine was this place where, the Germans came in and, the Ukrainians were kind of a little bit welcoming to the Germans, in some ways understandably, because they'd been repressed so much by the Soviets, right?
Yeah.
But in the Russian imagination,
the liquidation of the kulaks and all the rest of the mass murder that took place under Soviet communism.
Oh, the collectivization, the artificial famines. Like if you go to those places, when I was there, you could still find people who would remember the horrors that they experienced under the Soviet Union. And so, but in the Russian imagination, they're thinking this is another incursion by the West through this route, right? And that's why they get extremely touchy about it. If we had that kind of experience, it would be like having a third Pearl Harbor happen or something like that, right? Like that's kind of what's going on. So I think it's just important for Americans to understand that history, and I don't think they do.
So you have later stage Obama administration now leaning in to really muck around in Ukraine, getting involved. Zelensky ends up coming in and being more Western facing. One thing I will say, and I'm curious how you think about this. It seems to me that it is at least worth thinking about that when you hear American State Department CIA types talk about their influence themselves, that they're puffing themselves up because it's good for them to be seen as being more influential than maybe they even are. And I've revisited the history of not as some expert, but I've read some articles and some things and paid attention to some Iranians bringing this up, that the 1953 role of the CIA in Mossadegh's ouster has been wildly overstated. And I took that as like gospel, that like, wow, we actually maybe the United States government played a role in like destabilizing Iran. And it turns out maybe that's just not true. And the stories told by CIA people sound like they were like feathering their, I don't know if sure what the analogy is, feathering their nest. That's not quite right. Yeah. But puffing themselves up. Right. Look at us. Look at how easily we can overthrow a government. Like
gilding their own lilies.
Yeah. Like is that call with Victoria Nuland at least potentially like overblowing how much influence the U.S. government had in Ukraine, do you think? Or is that giving too much? Is that giving like not enough credit to what was going on?
I think we had a tremendous amount of influence in all the Eastern European countries during that time period. For the period that I was in Russia, we had a tremendous amount of influence on Russian policy. The people who were basically doing all the work in the Yeltsin government, they were products of Harvard, right? Who spoke English. And we actually sent campaign advisors who had an office in the Kremlin to help Yeltsin run for president again. We were pouring millions of dollars into the coffers of politicians that we liked, and we were doing things in the other direction to make sure that certain other politicians didn't rise. But when it got to the level of sending people out to the streets, funding media outlets who would deliver constantly favorable coverage to certain kinds of disruption, to either withholding or giving loans to certain politicians so that they could survive politically. We were massively interfering in the affairs of all those states. And, part of this is the arrogance of sort of unipolar America, which thought, that the Francis Fukuyama book was true and that history really had ended, and it was our time to basically dominate the world. But no, I don't think you're overstating our influence in that region at all.
When is one other piece of context that we were actually fighting a Cold War. I mean, there was 50 years of Cold War, right? So you have this like world in which, yeah, we're doing that. they're doing that to us. We're over there. They're in Cuba. They're in South America. They're turning all of the African continent into communists with from Zimbabwe all the way around. So
right. Patrice, we were, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, right? Like all those.
So it's sort of like I'm not saying I agree with all that. I'm saying I understand how we could end up in a place. I've had Mike Benz on the show, and I guess I have a slightly more realistic, though thinly held opinion that I think broadly we were the good guys in the Cold War, and we couldn't just let the Russians run the table on the globe as an expansionist Soviet power, and now we've got all this machinery that was built over that time that's almost like an autoimmune disease now that's like maybe starting to fight the host. I don't know. Like, how do you think about the legacy of the Cold War and how it impacts all of those machinations in the 21st century?
No, you're absolutely right. We I think we were on the right side of the Cold War. Having gone to school in the Soviet Union, I wouldn't want to grow up in one of those societies, right? The problem was, I think there was a massive misread of, the Russian people. We could have gone in, we could have done a Marshall Plan, we could have brought them in, rebuilt the country in the way we rebuilt Japan, and seen Russia as a permanent strategic partner. And we would be in, I think, a much better position right now. The Russian people were so, enamored with America when I got there. Like, when you went to a bar in Russia in the early 90s, and you could hold up your passport, and as soon as girls saw that blue, they would come in packs and come and talk to you. Like, everybody wanted a piece of what America was at the time. And to them, it represented not just wealth, but freedom. It was a very important thing to them, right? And so,
did you always wear Levi's?
I didn't always wear them, but
well, when you did, it went well.
I learned that what Russians actually look at are your shoes, and cops in particular, right? So, but yeah, no, they can tell who's American just by the way you walk. But no, I think the way we behaved since 1990 has been tremendously disillusioning for people in those Soviet bloc countries, right? Because they saw us as these avatars of, free speech and free expression, self-determination, and boy, did we turn out not to be that, right? And that's the way they see it.
So you have now messing around in Ukraine, 2014, late stage Obama administration. At almost the exact same time, if I'm remembering correctly, the vice president at the time, Joe Biden, is given like this issue as his purview, and his son Hunter Biden suddenly becomes like on the board of the Ukrainian gas company. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So what is, and I'm from reading about it, I think even people in the Obama administration more broadly were like, yeah, this is a real bad look. Why is he doing this?
Totally.
What's this all about? This is gonna mess with us. So you've gone deeper than I have on this. So what was going on there? Because this moment comes back in 2020 in a way that is crazy, and it underpins other stuff in the aftermath of 2016. So what's going on there?
So there was a Ukrainian oligarch named Mykola Zlochevsky who ran this gas company, Burisma, and there were, some corruption issues there, right? And with the changing of the political guard, they were deeply concerned about being penalized through certain international processes, right? Like, or there might be investigations or seizures. And so when they made a decision about who to put on the board, the Russians have an expression, they call it having a roof, right? Which means that your roof is like your mafia protector, right? And if people see that you have a tough roof, they will back off. In putting Hunter Biden on the board of Burisma, and he wasn't the only person. There were some ex-CIA figures on there. There was a former prime minister or president of Poland. There's a Canadian billionaire, if I'm not mistaken, on the board. There were all sorts of big Western heavies who were on the board, and what they were doing was buying.
And then a crackhead.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's like,
exactly.
At least some of these people maybe had done something productive in their lives.
Right, yeah. They were, and were at least capable of maybe fulfilling some kind of theoretical job there. No, this was all about the appearance of connections, buying the appearance of a roof, right? The Russians even wrote about it that way. They used those phrases. And, bringing in Hunter Biden, who got paid, what was it, $50,000 or $80,000 a month to do nothing. This money went to this firm. It's a perfect example of what we would call soft corruption. I would call it hard corruption, but whatever. It's not technically illegal, but it's clearly influence peddling, And so, yeah, the Obama government wasn't thrilled about it. The New York Times actually had some pretty good reporters who were on it early, but the paper didn't really follow through on that stuff. I don't think it was the reporter's fault necessarily, but that was
editors were like, "This isn't useful. This isn't helpful to our moral clarity."
Right? Yeah, exactly. Or maybe we can better use the time of these journalists, right? That's kind of the way they did it.
Yeah.
So
it's never worth forgetting that, is it Walter Duranty who was at the New York Times covering for the Soviets while they were butchering the Ukrainian people? Right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Just a reminder.
It's pretty tough to miss millions of bodies, but the Times was able to do it. So people do need to keep that in mind. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And this story was not a nothing burger, right? Whatever you want to say about it, it was enough of a story that several iterations of Ukrainian officials were concerned about it. Our own ethical bodies were concerned about it. And, it was briefly an issue while Biden was still in office. And then it came back in a big way.
So Biden was very proud of, and he had spoken it, you can find him on recording proudly saying, I went to Ukraine and I told them, you're not going to get $1 billion unless you fire this guy. Who was that guy? What was that?
There was a prosecutor general in Ukraine named Viktor Shokin, who was investigating Burisma, right? And Biden came in that bombastic way of his and basically demanded said that Ukraine wasn't going to get $1 billion in aid unless they got rid of this prosecutor general. Now, there are tapes that later surfaced of Biden having a conversation with the president, Petro Poroshenko, and he's saying, yeah, we fired him even though he didn't do anything wrong. So, thanks for that. But, that should have been, I think, kind of a scandal, right? There should have been a few more questions about it. Even if it wasn't exactly what it looked like, it looked bad, right? There were lots of cover stories told about what actually happened there. Some people said that, Biden wanted Shokin out because Shokin hadn't adequately addressed the corruption. But he was still looking at Burisma. There were actually raids on Burisma even after that moment, right? Before he was actually kicked out of office. So I don't know what the deal is, but it certainly looked like Biden was asking for Shokin to be taken out of office. And that's what Shokin says.
So the crux, one of the things I've taken us down this deep road here because it's like, we have some distance from all of this, and we've been able to see what has been shaken out just in time. You fast forward to the 2016 election. It's only a couple years after all of that, and we have this moment now that you stood apart from everyone else. And that is Donald Trump gets positioned by Hillary, by John Brennan, at the time the CIA director for Obama,
Comey,
James Comey, Clapper, who was the liar who covered up the Snowden revelations and lied before Congress about the NSA spying on every American. Like, how he's not in Supermax, I don't know. The same goes for John Brennan.
Yeah, Brennan had a little foible with Congress and testimony too. But
it's like, well, you're lying. I mean, aren't these high crimes? How are these not high crimes? This cohort of people come together to promote the Steele dossier, which is a fabrication, paid for fabrication. They bring it to Barack Obama as he's leaving office. And everything we know about this seems to say this was all the whole thing of like Trump is like compromised by Russia is all a deeply convoluted scam. And it has permeated our politics to such an extent because it was in our public consciousness pushed as the narrative for the entire first term of Donald Trump, that my neighbors, who are nice people and liberal Democrats, still believe it. You didn't.
no.
What were you seeing at the time that made you say, this all seems like a scam?
So first of all, this came out of nowhere. This whole idea that Donald Trump was secretly in the employ of Russia, it started to trickle out through a couple of stories, primarily before the election. There was a story in Yahoo that referenced an intelligence source who had seen reports suggesting that a Trump official was basically a cutout for the Kremlin. And I remember looking at that story and thinking, okay, but it's all anonymous. There's no way for me to check it, right? Like, it's a huge red flag for journalists when you cannot reproduce the experiment in the lab. Like, if they don't give you enough to work with so that you can trace the story, then something's up, right? And there were just too many of those stories. There was another one that was in Mother Jones that talked about how, it was titled something like "A Veteran Spy," talks about, Trump and blackmail or something like that. And it was all about how Russians had the ability to blackmail Donald Trump. And this came out like a week before the election. And the reporter is somebody I knew, David Korn. Again, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, there's no way for me to check this. Like, how do I verify any of this material? And it just started to come out like leaks from the government, always through people familiar with the matter or, the 6 U.S. officials. Like, there was no way to trace it. And it was always saying something very, very aggressive, like, Donald Trump has had these secret meetings with Russians. He's been involved in election interference. He was tied to the leaking of these emails from over the summer. But
right, because you had Hillary Clinton, who was illegally running her emails on a private server. That all got leaked by WikiLeaks. And so then it was like, this is all a Russian hack thing. It was because we had her emails revealed, right? That was part of the backdrop of how to tie together the Russia thing.
Yeah, and even that was just attributed to somebody's assessment of how that happened, right? And
yeah, because Mike Benz doesn't think that the Russians even had anything to do with hacking the server.
Yeah, it would be very difficult to establish that was the case. There was subsequently, much later, way too late for it to be important. There was testimony from the people who examined the servers who said, we didn't actually have evidence of anything being exfiltrated at that time, right? They only thought they did. But in the moment, it was just a bunch of anonymously sourced stories. And as I always tell people, like, I didn't care, right? Like, I wasn't a fan of Donald Trump. I was in the middle of publishing a book called Insane Clown President, right? About Trump. Like, if it turned out to be true, I was going to probably be happy about it. But the story didn't smell right, and there was no way to confirm it. And there were a few other people in media, a very few, in the sort of mainstream press. Glenn Greenwald was one. Mm-hmm. Michael Tracy, who worked at the Young Turks. Aaron Mate, who worked at The Nation, or who sometimes worked for The Nation. And there were a couple of academics, including a good friend of mine named Stephen Cohen from Princeton. We kind of said, where's the beef on this thing, right? And again, it wasn't like an ideological thing. It was just a reporting thing. Like, yeah. I'm happy to do it. Like, I don't give a like, just give me something to work with. And they didn't have anything. And then from there, it very quickly became like a shunning exercise, like something I had never seen in journalism, where everybody, was sort of standing up and saying, you're a denialist. It was like straight out of The Crucible or, the Salem witch trials or something like that. Like, what do you mean a denialist? Like, I'm supposed to be skeptical. That's my job as a journalist is to say, what do you mean, where, why, when, who, right? And they were asking us to do the opposite. And so, that was sort of the first problem that I had with Rolling Stone. I was going to cover every month of Trump's presidency, like kind of in the style of Herodotus, just sort of listing everything that happened. But
that was your beat, right? That was your beat.
It was, yeah, but I kept running up against all these statements by Democratic politicians about Russia that I said, I can't run this stuff. It's uncheckable, right? And so we ended up at this thing where I had to be kind of taken off that beat, right?
So you have this stretch of time in which all of the news media, by and large, outside, and it's all super partisan, but in like conventional old school newsrooms, there was a book about this, that your typical corporate press newsroom, ABC, NBC, CNN, all votes more solidly Democrat than Berkeley, California. It's north of 90%.
It was 93% was the stat I saw in the Washington Post right around that time.
So you've got a super duper, super turbo majority, effectively like almost Microsoft in the 90s level monopoly politically in the news media, who have all said, our narrative is Trump is compromised by Russia, and now Russia's bad, even though we didn't think they were bad, but they're bad. And also that really the Russians functionally hacked the election.
Yeah, they use that term all the time.
So, and Rick Stengel's book, Information Wars, he came into the Obama administration as an undersecretary under Kerry from running Time magazine. So he went right from super corporate press into being literally, and he calls himself this, and he says this proudly, like chief propagandist. He says, quote, I like propaganda. Propaganda is good. He also hates the First Amendment and has written in 2019 that the First Amendment sucks and we should throw it away and do European-style hate speech laws.
It was like a design flaw or something, right?
Yeah. It's like, well, but there's this narrative being constructed that Russia had tried out mass hybrid war manipulation. They succeeded in Crimea, and they were so super sophisticated at this. And there was this IRA, this Russian agency that was buying Facebook ads and propping up fake things. And there was dashboards that laid out all the people who were Russian. So the election outcome of 2016 was summarily, systematically denied repeatedly for 4 years. What part of that has any truth in it?
None of it. It's all completely, well, okay. There may have been a small scale program to buy ads, right? Like political ads, but through this internet research agency. But this was a tiny, tiny program. And if you read the ads, they are very ambiguous and weird and eccentric, and you wouldn't immediately think that it was like anti-Trump propaganda. Like it would take some doing to,
or anti-Hillary,
or anti-Hillary, right, or pro-Trump, right. But the essence of the conspiracy theory that they've laid out is so unbelievably stupid that it boggles the mind that professional journalists actually believe this. So their theory. Now, on the one end, you have these Facebook ads, and it's an incredibly small number of ads. It's it's a few thousand, basically. It's before the election, it was $2,900 worth of ads, right? Which is, in the scope of the amount of money that we spend on, right?
Roughly like $1 billion on either side.
Right,
spent.
yeah, it's half a second of messaging in a traditional presidential campaign. But okay, let's say the Russians actually spent, let's say they spent 500 times that. Their theory is that these Facebook ads were made the difference, and that Donald Trump's people helped Russia by telling them where to deploy those ads, because the Russians would have been too stupid to figure that out themselves, right? So the theory is information from the Trump campaign goes through this character, Konstantin Kilimnik, with whom I've spoken. By the way, nobody else except me and Aaron Mate interviewed this guy. His number's in the Mueller report, and nobody called him. That information went from the Trump campaign through this guy, somehow from there through to the Russian secret services so that they could buy a few $1,000s worth of Facebook ads. Like, think about how dumb you have to be to believe that as a story. The state of Russia could have legally walked into New York and commissioned $500 million worth of polling to find out where the most vulnerable parts of the Trump campaign were and the Hillary campaign were. And that would have been absolutely fine. They wouldn't have needed inside information from Donald Trump. And if they wanted to actually affect the election, they could have done it with a lot more money than the amount that they spent. But this is what they came up with, and smart people signed off on it. Like, they sent it up to flagpole, and everyone just went like that. And it was flabbergasting.
You've called it at different times. So it's like, if nothing comes of this, if nothing is revealed to suggest something bigger than the nothing that has been presented, that it's maybe the greatest political scandal in American history.
Yeah, because it was not just about defaming the Trump administration. It was not just about changing electoral outcomes. It was about fundamentally changing how Americans interpreted reality, right? Remember, there was a moment in the Bush presidency where I forget which official it was, said, we're in the reality making business, right? Like, when we tell people they got to go to war, like, they go. But this was the real thing. Like, as you mentioned, you go anywhere in America, you'll find people who believe this, and they don't believe it with their brains. They believe it like somewhere down here in their guts.
It's baked in such a way where, like, literally, people are going to go to their deathbed believing that the Russians hacked 2016 and that we're on the path to autocracy because everything's been thrown upside down.
It's amazing
because of that,
right? And it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or something like that. You're meeting these people who they look like the same people you knew 5 years ago. They're dressed in the same clothes, but it's just they're gone, right? Like their brains are gone. And we did so much messaging, and there was so much coordination between sort of the political forces who cooked up this stuff and the corporate media folks who pressed it, and they pressed it repeatedly over and over and over again every single day, 24 hours a day. It was the biggest story in the world for 3 years. And they suppressed everybody else, right? So I think that, Stengel talks about Crimea being an experiment for the Russians. I think Russiagate was our experiment. It was our experiment in being able to completely change reality for a majority of the country. And, they did it. They were extremely successful in just in pulling off this thing. And I think it's changed forever how we understand political information.
To bring us up to the more recent past, so we have this entangled, bizarre consensus/disaster of the vice president and his son intertwined in Ukraine in ways that, if they aren't criminal, they probably should be, or they should at least, like, you can't be the second most powerful person in the American government and have any immediate family members profiting by millions with our adversaries or in the midst of, like, internet. Like, that all seems crazy. It's all crazy.
Yeah, you can't have that. No,
so then you have 3.5 years of the entire media saying, brainwashing willing participants in a delusion about Russia hacking the election, denying the election outcomes of 2016. Abrams, I mean, this is all well-worn territory, but it's like we had 4 years of election denialism from the left. I have a friend who worked at the Stanford Internet Observatory.
Really?
Actually, who said, oh yeah, that was just Democrat election denialism, 2016. So then we come upon, I'm going to fast forward to Elon Musk, because now what comes next can all be understood through what you actually discovered with the Twitter files. Elon Musk DMs you. How did that happen? Like, how did it happen that Elon Musk, like, was it 2022?
22, yeah.
So yeah, like, was it because he saw you on Rogan, or Rogan said, hey, I like that Taibbi guy, he's who I follow on Twitter? Like, how did it happen that Elon DMs you for this thing to happen?
Yeah, I think he was watching Rogan. Either Joe or one of Joe's guests said, like, if you want to understand, you go to a really good investigative reporter in this country, you got to follow Matt Taibbi. And I think Elon saw that. Then when he bought Twitter, there began to circulate this rumor that he was going to open up the files to somebody. And
I think he asked, didn't he tweet? Did he tweet like a survey, like, should I release the files or something?
Right. Yeah. It was this thing. And I obviously got a little like journo stiffy about that, and I put out an article basically not so subtly raising my hand and suggesting that I would be down for that assignment. And then out of the blue, I got a DM saying, would you like to look at, basically the secret files of Twitter and its censorship efforts over the years? And I said yes. And it started this whole brouhaha. I misunderstood him. Like he wanted me in San Francisco the next morning. I didn't understand that, how his time calendar worked. So I had to get on like the next plane. And but yeah, no, it ended up that I had this meeting with him, and this began the process of what the Twitter files came to be, which is just releasing. Not even releasing. He basically just turned over a gigantic pile of stuff and said, "Mazel tov, go look at all this, and tell us what you find." And so that's how that started. I suggested starting with the Hunter Biden laptop story only because there had been some indications that the FBI had reached out to social media companies. And I thought, if we're going to find censorship or government censorship, that might be where it would be. So that's where we started.
To take a step back and think about journalism and sources, help me understand what this is. Because, okay, we mentioned all the president's men, but there's also the Pentagon Papers, which I kind of only partially remember, but it's like this big deal in journalism, the Pentagon Papers. So that's like leaked government documents, right?
Yep.
So the leak is technically illegal. Just like with the WikiLeaks, the leak may have technically been like a violation of something. But as a journalist...
And Snowden.
Yeah, and Snowden too. So Snowden has technically violated the law by releasing the fact that the NSA was doing hardcore criminal stuff. But what has been the understanding of what your role as a journalist is in dealing with sources that are compromised? Like Elon's bought this thing. He's biased. He wants Twitter he wants all kinds of who knows what. You don't know whether what he's giving you access to is everything or filtered or who knows. So as a journalist, what's your role, responsibility? What has been the understanding about how to confront this opportunity?
So first of all, the Twitter files were basically unprecedented in terms of journalism. You mentioned really the only two close precedents, which were the whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg bringing the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, and Neil Sheehan. Remember the movie The Bright Shining Lie?
No, I haven't seen that movie.
Oh, it's a very good Vietnam movie, but he wrote that. Excellent reporter, but it came from a whistleblower. The thing that makes that story like the Twitter files was the sheer quantity of stuff, right? Like that's why this is close. Same thing with Snowden. When Edward Snowden came to Glenn, he brought with him an amount of material that was just mind-boggling. Like, but there's still, years and years and years of stuff they haven't gone through. In both those cases, however, it was somebody who had basically purloined a big government pile of documents. In this case, it was essentially...
Can I ask a dumb question?
Yeah.
What does purloined mean?
To steal.
Okay, got it. All right.
Yeah, I was using a gentler word because... well, no, the reason being that you're kind of allowed to do this if the material is illegal, right? Like, in other words, you're allowed to tell a journalist about illegal activity. The Supreme Court has also said journalists can report stolen material. There's a Supreme Court case, from the early 90s that is directly on point to this stuff. So these are things you have to know if you're an investigative reporter because the ethics of this are important.
Right.
It had never happened that the CEO of a major corporation had brought in a reporter and basically said, do what you will with this stuff I just bought, right? And because there are privacy issues, there are legal issues, there are, as you said, there are bias issues, there's all kinds of things. So I had to on the fly come up with some kind of framework that would allow us to do this reporting. I talked to people like Seymour Hersh, who had done very high level reporting about secret stuff. But even Tsai's, biggest story along these lines, which was this thing called the family jewel story involving the CIA. He didn't have all the stuff. He just had it described to him. So this was new territory. Like nobody knew how to, there was no playbook for how to do this. I ended up coming up with a system that was basically, the idea was we were only going to publish things that were by themselves factually important and newsworthy. In other words, if some other set of facts came out, it would still be true, right?
How would you know that?
Well,
help me understand what that means.
So, okay.
Use an example at the start.
Okay. So we start to see documents that say flagged by the FBI, right? That that Twitter is somehow in communication with the FBI about content. Now, no matter what else happens, right? If it turns out that the FBI is also flagging things for legitimate reasons, right? Like this is child or this is whatever, right? If they're flagging stuff just because it's what they think of as disinformation, that's by itself a news story. Like no other context that's going to come out, I don't think is going to change that. No, it's always a guessing game. Every source that you have in every journalistic enterprise has motives. You don't ever know. What
were the motives of Deep Throat?
Well, right. Yeah, exactly. Anybody or Ellsberg for that matter, right? Like that's why Watergate happened. They were, they started by trying to discredit Ellsberg as a source. They went through his psychiatrist's office looking for derogatory information. So anyway, point being, you're never sure. It's always a guessing game. But even before we got to that point, we had to read all this stuff and figure out what it all meant, right? And take a stab at that. And because it was so difficult and new and laden with jargon, it was an extremely complicated, mental exercise just to pare things down to a couple of facts that we could report. So, I tried to be as conservative as possible in terms of limiting the scope of what we were putting out, but it was still hard.
The first, well, before I get to some of the reporting itself, what is going on with you in your own mind at this moment? It is 2022. We have been through 2020 and 2021 are the craziest period of time in my adult life, between the COVID lockdowns, the election, January 6th, the aftermath of that, and now we're still sort of in this COVID haze with the Biden administration talking about how Facebook's killing people. But some of us at least are like, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our neighbors feel like they've lost their minds. And Elon Musk goes from being, if you want to take Kara Swisher as a avatar for the elite consensus, who's not so wacky she's a full-blown communist, but is an Atlantic. She's the stand-in. She's like the human version of the Atlantic. So Kara Swisher types of people love Elon Musk. Oh, he's fighting climate change. Oh, electric cars. He's the greatest. Oh, he's sort of in secular progressive San Francisco. La-di-da. To he's literally Hitler.
Right.
He's literally Hitler. In fact, I think right around that same time, there's like the Elon is the new Hitler
Totally.
stuff happening.
There were front page stories in the New York Times about how he was a chaos agent. They were interviewing. It was all the same techniques from Russiagate, anonymous sources familiar with the matter. We're worried that he's, that he might have, unhealthy associations, that sort of thing.
He got UAE money to buy Twitter or Saudi or something. Pay no attention to the fact that we never asked Al Gore how the oil barons bought current TV. Like, this is all crazy.
Or that there had been Saudi interests in the previous regime's ownership of Twitter, but whatever.
So you're like, this is this crazy story, but this is the hell. Like, what's going through your head at that moment? Like, are you like, am I ready for this? Or this is the business I've chosen. I'm all in.
So I was excited. Like, I had been covering internet censorship since 2018. In fact, it was another one of those things that, kind of helped smooth my exit from the business, is that I could not get people interested in this phenomenon of people being removed from the internet. Like when Alex Jones got kicked off, right?
There's this cancel culture post 2013 of deplatforming.
Yeah,
Patreon kicking people off, Vimeo kicking people off.
Yeah, and again, I was looking at press colleagues and saying, it's not how we do things. Like, when we get stuff wrong, we get sued, right? Like, you got to wait for the lawsuit to happen, and then maybe after that it ends your career, right? But also, like, the whole point is, we don't leave this process to an unaccountable, hidden corporate bureaucracy whose decisions are irreversible. Like, that's completely antithetical to what America is all about. So I was very interested in this story. I had purposely done more stories about censorship of people on the left than the right, because I was trying very hard to get people in media interested in this story. So I wrote about the Democratic Socialists of America. I wrote about the World Socialist website. I wrote about Chris Hedges. I wrote all these people, right? Nothing. Nobody cared, right? And when Elon opened up these files, my thinking was, I was finally going to get to see the evidence of how exactly this worked. But also, selfishly, I thought, that I was going to be one of the few people who was going to be able to do this. Like, I was very worried about the possibility of, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post getting hold of this material, right? Because I knew exactly what they would do with it. They would turn it into an argument for the other thing, right? They would find a way to make the internal correspondence of Twitter a horror story about speech, right? And so I was very anxious to do this and play it straight, right? And so I was game. I was gung ho. This was the prime of my career, and it was an unbelievable story.
So I made a leap. We were a lot of detail. 2016, Trump gets elected. Russiagate's nonsense. We leap now into the middle of the Biden years and the Twitter files. It is the fall of 2022. You have gotten access to this thing, but as a geek, you've got files filled with text. There's no table of contents, so you've got to search them using some kind of search criteria to even try to understand. Like, just give me a little window into, like, how did you even extract information out of this unknown mass of stuff? Like, how are you going about trying to actually do it? Today, now we actually probably throw this stuff at like Claude and have it start to like construct with references things and derive stuff. But we didn't have that in 2022 publicly in any meaningful sense. So how did it physically work?
Yeah, so you have to find a way, first of all, to find something to say about something, right? And that's how when I started doing the financial crisis reporting, I would, at the beginning of my interviews, I would say, I'm a financial illiterate. I need you to tell me something about something that will, that I can communicate to ordinary people about how this happened, right? So you got to start with, let's find something simple that's in there that we can communicate. So first of all, the mechanics of this were very complicated because Elon is very mercurial. The means by which we got documents changed from minute to minute. At one point, it would go through a lawyer. At another moment, we had a couple of laptops and were essentially just allowed to search through a period of Twitter's stuff. And we took the bulk of our material during those 2 days, right, or 3 days. And what we ended up doing is just getting a ton of stuff. We started with names, right? So we looked for names of, we made categories, right? So here are Twitter officials over here. Here are government officials over here. Here are heads of NGOs, right? And so that...
Did you have some sense going in from the earlier reporting of the landscape of this censorship industrial complex, as Michael Schellenberger would go on to call it?
There was no reporting. That was part of the problem, was that there was nothing on paper. Like, it turned out, you mentioned Mike Benz. He did have a website that none of us had seen that contained a lot of information about things like the Stanford Internet Observatory, but none of us had heard of that, right? We didn't know who Mike Benz was. So we were just going off. It's interesting if the FBI is talking to Twitter, so let's get an email address, right, of, let's say, Elvis Chan, who was the San Francisco field office agent at the FBI. Let's get every email that ever came into Twitter from Elvis Chan and see where that takes us.
Okay.
Right? So you start there. Then from there, you get the names of 6 or 7 more FBI people. Then you start to get names of organizations, the FITF, the Foreign Influence Task Force. What the that, right? I never heard of that before.
FITFA.
Right, yeah.
You got to find a way to take these acronyms and make them into a sound, right? FITFA?
FITFA, yeah. I mean, it was very acronym laden. Which I immediately saw was going to be a problem with the story because, people forget acronyms, right? Yeah. So that's how we did it. There were two different ways to approach it. Like, when Barry Weiss came in, she already had certain stories that she was interested in, like Jay, right? So she was interested in Jay Bhattacharya. We did a search on him. I was there with her when we queued up his name in this weird database they had there, and immediately we get the screenshot and the word blacklist is on there. That was one of the first scoops that we had. But
up to that point, Twitter executives had gone into the public on their websites and on Joe Rogan saying, proclaiming that they didn't shadow ban and such, right?
Yeah.
So you caught them red-handed, that they were liars.
They had this hilarious thing that is like, is there shadow banning on Twitter? I forget what the headline said exactly, but it was essentially, is there shadow banning on Twitter? No, there is not. That was the first line, right? But it turns out that's a complete lie. They don't call it shadow banning. They called it visibility filtering. And visibility filtering, it turned out, was this. If you can imagine Twitter as being like a giant mixing studio, like for, where if the Queen is recording an album or something like that, right? They can turn up this person all the way up over here, so you hear the cymbals louder, and they can turn the guitars down over here, and they have
less Bhattacharya, more cowbell.
More cowbell, exactly.
which is basically the best way to think about all official narratives from the government is more cowbell.
Fellas, I gotta have more cowbell, and that's really what they were like. It sounds stupid, but that's really what it was. It was a series of dials. If you eliminate all the jargon, it was more of this, less of that. Right? They had automatic processes, which I was really scared of, where if you retweeted a certain kind of person, you yourself got de-amplified, right? So,
like your other unrelated stuff.
Yeah. So, like, let's say somebody who has anti-vaccine views has watched the same Bruins game that you did, right? And says, that was a fantastic goal that Pasternak scored, right? And you retweet that, right? And it's got a picture of the goal and everything. Well, you have no idea, but you've just de-amplified yourself by, 0.8% or some crazy thing like that. You can get yourself on a list. They had a list called is_Russian, right? And you could get on is_Russian by retweeting Jill Stein, by retweeting Julian Assange, and lots of other crazy ways. So figuring out the mechanics of all this was fascinating, but it ultimately just came down to more of this, less of that.
The first story, the first thread, ends up being a partial story that gets filled out over time, and that is the Hunter Biden laptop. So we spent a good amount of time in this conversation laying the groundwork for people who aren't familiar with this. Hunter Biden and his role. And now we are sitting in 2022 and you are looking at this Hunter Biden laptop story. So with the fullness of time, looking back, for someone who doesn't know anything, or especially for my neighbors who in their gut thinks there's something Russia thing with Trump and just were completely dismissive of any talk of Hunter Biden and his laptop because it all had the stench and whatnot. What happened with that story? What is the truth as we understand it now that was revealed not just in the Twitter files, but in the subsequent context?
So first, Twitter and the other platforms, but, I was looking at Twitter. They made a decision very early to not only shut that story down, but to use the most extreme tools that they had. Like Twitter has, as I said, a million dials. One of them is a tool they only use for like child pornographers, which is you cannot even send this by direct message to a friend of yours, right? That is, break this in case of emergency, break this glass. They pulled that out for this story. This story was completely not to be seen by anybody. They also locked the account of the New York Post, which ran that story. So a venerable, America's oldest newspaper. And internally, their reasoning was, first they said it was because it was hacked materials, which is not a reason to dismiss a story because it could still be true. Then they said, well, essentially what they said is we don't want 2016 to happen again, right? And
yes,
and that when I saw that, I thought, okay, this is very bad, right? Because Twitter was essentially making a political judgment. They were saying the WikiLeaks leaks from 2016 which were true, right, had affected the election, had led to Donald Trump being elected, and we can't have that. So we're going to turn this story off.
And did that type of message come from government actors like Elvis Chan? References to 2016?
Well, yes and no. Like we knew that Twitter was meeting with the FBI, that they had warned broadly of what they called hack and leak material, right? And then we saw on the other end the Twitter officials saying, well, we can't let hack and leak material through. So there was a little bit of a missing piece there where we didn't have the FBI stuff initially. We didn't have that. But it turned out that this was exactly what happened, that Twitter was meeting regularly with those FBI folks, that the FBI people had, in fact, warned ahead of time about this exact story, right? Not only that, there had been an exercise that had taken place at the Aspen Institute, of all places, where a gathering of some of the most influential political journalists in America had been briefed in advance about this story and had done a wargaming exercise about how to not cover it. And we found that in the Twitter files.
This is the tabletop exercise. In reviewing this material in the past 8 months, the thing that's been so shocking to me about this one in particular, of all the things, is like, I've talked to other people about this who just random friends. And when I describe what it is, they're like, wait, what now? Like there was so much complexity in the Twitter files storytelling, and it all came out somewhat non-linearly, that I feel like certain things got lost.
Absolutely.
And so, as I understand it, fill me in if I fill in the gaps for me. But as I understand it, you had the Aspen Institute, which is like, sort of one of these poster child of the sort of the like TED talky global power elite type people.
It's like a WEF outpost.
Right. And it's an old institution. You have, I think, is it the then CEO of NPR is among the people who set this up, along with the Stanford folks and CISA, which is a government agency.
CISA had some people there, if I'm remembering correctly.
So you have this like constant commingling, many of whom get government funding quite substantially, like Stanford and NPR, which is state-run media functionally, or was. Now
the Aspen Institute, too?
The Aspen Institute got millions of dollars. So there's this like laundering of federal dollars into these so-called nonprofits who would literally not be able to survive absent the money. And so that's an enormous amount of government influence. And they come together to conspire to overturn the Pentagon Papers sort of premise, right? Because that's what that, in fact, wasn't that even talked about?
Yes.
So we talked about the Pentagon Papers. What exactly were they talking about? Because they basically came together to say, how do we overturn what has been understood to be journalism in case something from Burisma leaks that we definitely don't already know anything about?
Yeah, unbelievably, there is a paper that's authored, I believe, by a Stanford professor, right? But it's essentially, how do we overturn the Pentagon Papers standard, right? And the Pentagon Papers standard is just, if it's true, it runs, right? Their idea, they wrote this whole academic paper where the idea was we have to make provenance more important than the material. So where it came from is more important than what it is. So if it comes from, let's say, the Russians or hackers or whatever, right?
Republicans. Just as bad.
Right? That's what we got to care about, is the provenance, not not the factuality. Now, again, I'm now old school. I'm a dinosaur in this business. We don't care, right? What's in the stuff, as long as the stuff is true. And here we have this whole intellectual sector saying we have to overturn that whole way of doing business and get people to think in terms of what's the political impact of this? Is it going to help or hurt, or what is it? Whereas the traditional American way of looking at all information is, and even especially, I would say, secret information, is that, the truth will set you free, right? Like, we're grown-ups. We need to hear this stuff. And they were saying something the opposite. And they had this, the even more shocking part of this to me, and I didn't find this part, Michael Schellenberger found this. It was this tabletop exercise. And you had representatives from the New York Times, the Washington Post, which these are the two papers that were known for the Pentagon Papers episode.
Washington Post, who changed their slogan to "Democracy dies in darkness" after 2016.
Right, democracy dies in darkness. But they had a movie out at the moment about the
Spielberg movie.
Yeah, right.
Meryl Streep.
Yeah, and here they are doing the opposite. And not only that, but they were giving off the record privileges to each other and to the Aspen Institute folks.
What does that mean?
So a bunch of reporters get together and meet with a bunch of officials, and everybody says, "Okay, we're all going to agree that this is off the record," right?
So cone of silence, folks, while we plot to undermine a story that some of us at this table know is true because they already have this laptop and have had it since the beginning of the year.
Exactly. Like, how can you promise to make, like, if the story turns out to be true, if it turns out to be real, you've committed to not report on it by agreeing to the off the record terms. Like, the instant that story comes out, this meeting that we're having right now becomes newsworthy, right? But I've just committed to not reporting on it, which, ethically, I can't even tell you, like, when I first saw this, my brain went, like, in knots. Like, I thought to myself, what would Cy Hirsch think if he looked at this, right? Like, he would have a heart attack if he looked at that. It's incredible that this happened, but it was very emblematic of what was going on in media.
So you have this moment where you have this story that is highly consequential, in which the leading candidate, inner circle and son, is revealed to have been like this grotesque character engaged in seedy business dealings with a country who will soon be embroiled in war. And actually a country who just a little while ago was part of the justification for impeaching the current president, right? Because that was the impeachment of Trump, and the first term was like, at least the first one, I can't remember, was like, because they had a phone call basically being like, hey, can you look into all this crazy stuff going on with the Bidens, basically, which was all actually really happening. So we can't let any of that happen. We have to shut down this October surprise. There's all kinds of other stuff that comes out in the Twitter files.
One quick thing. You mentioned that a lot of stuff got lost because we didn't put things out. It didn't come out in a way that was always coherent. Or didn't conform to a timeline that was always made sense to people. That was a mistake. I think one of my thoughts when I first saw this material is, whatever this project is not going to last long, right?
Yeah.
And so
the lawyers are going to say, Elon, you're going to go you're going to be sued into oblivion and bankrupted. You have to shut this down.
Yeah, at minimum, I mean, that was going to happen, or he was going to lose his SpaceX contracts, or something else was going to go on.
Right.
And so we had our, it was a little room of us. And I was really pounding the table for, we have to get this stuff out as fast as possible, right? So anything that makes sense, let's just put it out,
Yeah.
right? And we also thought we needed to do that to stay ahead of the propaganda that was coming out about this being a nothing burger and everything. So in hindsight, I wish maybe we had taken some more time so that these things would have been presented in a different way. But at the moment, I thought it was the only way.
The attempts, the media's portrayal, including in a PBS Frontline documentary, which features you and Michael, relatively briefly considering the subject matter, is and essentially the consensus of the Democratic Party or Democrats, let's say, was nothing to see here. This is all just private content moderation. Private companies are allowed to moderate what people can and can't do, and you have freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach on a platform. So you don't have the right to have Twitter magnify your post. That's not a right you have as an American. Move on, nothing burger. What's your response to somebody who had that implanted by the people they trust?
I'll start with a story. So at the very beginning of my career, my first job in journalism was as an intern to Wayne Barrett, who was a famous investigative reporter at the Village Voice in New York. Next to Wayne Barrett sat a guy named Nat Hentoff, who was the high priest of liberalism in America and the most ardent supporter of free speech in the country, right? He was the person who heard about every speech case in the country. When he wrote about it, it mattered. And Nat Hentoff was one of the people who made a big fuss when the FBI sent one letter to Death Row Records after NWA put out its single, F the Police. Remember that song?
Oh, yeah. This is back when it was like, oh, see, the right-wingers, they want to shut down expression, which wasn't false. I mean, Yeah.
Right, yeah. It's actually a great song.
The right-wingers and Tipper Gore. So there was,
Right.
But Republican, basically Gore Clinton in the late 90s were basically Republicans by today's standards.
But it was one letter. It was a very polite letter, right? It said, it was pleading. It basically said, look, this song is going to get cops killed, right? Maybe you might not want to put out that single. Biggest story, speech story in a long time. Every newspaper in the country covered it. The Washington Post, New York Times, everybody. One letter from the FBI. The Twitter files, we had thousands of communications, tens of thousands of communications, not just about one rap group, but about whole ranges of people, and not just about Republicans, not just about right-wingers, people on the left, right? Like, it was the Yellow Vest movement in Europe. It was people who liked Maduro in Venezuela. It was all kinds of people. And the FBI had an opinion about everything. And it wasn't just the FBI. As we find out, it's every agency in the government. It's the CIA. It's the health organizations, the CDC, like the DHS.
It's all the plaintiffs in the Missouri versus Biden.
Exactly.
They're listed, and it's like a murderer's row of the entire federal government.
Right, and we even found the email where they talked about the mechanics of that. Everything that comes from federal government agencies goes through the belly button of the FBI. Everything that comes from the states goes through DHS, which is the only body that has a legal mandate to do propaganda or to talk to the American people in a certain way, right? So
that's FBI, which is technically part of the Department of Justice,
right,
and then DHS, Department of Homeland Security, which houses, TSA, all that stuff.
Right, exactly. CISA, which is the cybersecurity agency.
The Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, right? Isn't it? They got security in their name twice. That's
exactly,
how much they love us.
They even talked about that, how we're so concerned about security, we put it in our acronym twice. But my point is, if one letter was important in 1989 or 1990 or whatever it was, tens of thousands of letters on a weekly or monthly basis, in addition to regular in-person meetings with law enforcement officials about content, and not even about, big things, but like little accounts, like with people who had as few as 6 followers. The FBI was worried about that stuff. So this is a comprehensive speech policing program. It is not just the government opining about one thing. It was an entire industrial scale effort.
We could go on for 3 more hours to go through the
of course.
details of this, but I think this gave viewers who weren't familiar like a sample of. Is there anything before we move on to the present day of speech that people would need to know if this was the only encounter they have with your reporting on the Twitter files? Is there anything that we did that we missed? That's really you want to make sure? Like no. One more thing.
The one thing that I would say is, towards the end of the Twitter files, we started to get more and more indications about the internationalization of speech codes, right? And we didn't really understand that at the time. There were so many organizations, so many acronyms, but if you look overseas now and see how Europe works, right? And it's every country in Europe has its own speech laws, but they're overlaid by one big speech law that allows them to raid houses for, put people in jail for tweets and things like that. Mm-hmm. Like that's what we were seeing coming towards us, right? And it's the reason why I think people on the left misunderstand what the Twitter files are, because they were portrayed as this pro-Trump campaign exercise when it was really, we were trying to sound a warning about something that was happening everywhere around the world, and that's what I would suggest.
Was either I think it was last summer. Man, everything's moving so fast now. In the Vice President Vance, newly in office at that point, I think this would have been last summer, went to Munich and decried the European treatment of they don't have legal free speech. They have hate speech laws, whatever that means. Hate is in the eye. How do you know someone's intention? You can't. There was one of the major networks, it might have been PBS or NBC, did a story about Germany's treatment of this.
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes. They did, and you see these German bureaucrats chuckling about like imprisoning people for calling politicians a Pimmel, which is German for dick.
Right. Right.
Or just saying naughty things, naughty in the eyes of the state. As we sit here today in 2026, a couple things have happened in this almost unbelievable return of Donald Trump. So one thing is that Trump actually won. So the notion that the censorship industrial complex could so successfully brainwash everyone, on top of all the legal assaults on him and whatnot, at least we should maybe feel good that even if you don't like Trump, they couldn't brainwash the public into not voting for it. It's kind of amazing. He shouldn't have been able to win re-election if they have as much power as they want, right? How do you think about that?
Well, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how speech works. People instinctively hate censors. It is ingrained in the spirit of most human beings, but especially Americans. Americans cannot stand the idea of being told what to think and told that they can't see something. And so this became a huge issue for Trump. You know, Vance brought it up in his debate, at the towards the end with Tim Walz, who was the worst spokesperson the Democrats could possibly have chosen for the speech issue, totally misunderstanding things like that hate speech is legal in the United States, right? And he talked about the difference, the crisis that would be on the way if the Democrats won on the speech front. Now, things have turned out a certain way since then, but you're absolutely right. It shows the power, the negative power that this kind of behavior has. Like, people just recoil from it, and they will vote against it.
It's been a mixed bag. Give your scorecard, your quick scorecard on the Trump administration broadly on the free speech front. Because there was a bunch of early stuff that was pretty good, right? USAID, which was funding a lot of these nonsense organizations.
They got rid of GEC.
The Global Engagement Center, so that's Rick Stengel's domestic propaganda scam. Terrible guy, terrible person. But yeah, so give me your picture of like good, bad, ugly. What's the average score?
So I would say it's been, bad. The Trump administration, I think they fundamentally misunderstand speech law, or they're indifferent to it. They keep doing a lot of the same stuff that Biden was doing, like he's sort of publicly trying to pressure. But the difference is that Biden was doing it privately and secretly and through, sort of hidden levers. Trump is just openly up there saying, yeah, maybe we should pull their FCC license. Like, you can't do that either, right? Like, that's messed up. But I get in trouble all the time with kind of formerly liberal friends, right? For saying, I still think the other thing is way worse, because they were so much more ambitious in terms of their thinking about speech than Trump is. Trump may ignore the First Amendment in different episodes, but what this other thing was an effort to build an entire structure to subvert it, which hasn't happened yet. Now, maybe Trump will get to that, but they haven't done that yet.
It seems like there is very much a fundamental ideological belief that's baked into the history of progressivism that the public's too stupid. I actually had a conversation with Bill de Blasio. It was kind of nice, because it's hard to get people from other sides to come on shows where they think they're not going to whatever. So, I'd love to have more people that have a different worldview come on the show. But Bill did, and I laid out something that he said, yeah, that's a pretty good assessment. There's sort of two branches of progressive thought as I think about it. One is sort of a William Jennings Bryant kind of populism that is a bottom up kind of thing, and is a power to the people skeptic. Like, I'd put Upton Sinclair in this category. People who were skeptical of concentrations of power. They did think government could be used to counter private power, like corporate power. And I think they often made the mistake there, because then they just team up and it gets worse. But it's like an honestly held attempt to defend the power and like sort of sovereignty of the individual, more or less. And then you have the Woodrow Wilson types. You have the credentialed scientific elite who believe that, look, we are in this modern age and we need to have people that understand the technical details. And the average rube just doesn't have the knowledge or doesn't have the credentials to understand when something's a lie. And therefore, we need to filter the information. And you get like people like that Catherine Marr, who's like, well, sometimes the truth just gets in the way of getting things done. Which is a statement that's instantly disqualifying for you to play any role in anything. Like literally anything. Like if you are going to dispense with the truth, I don't know what job on this planet you are qualified to engage in, because you're just saying I'm a liar.
I guess you can be a politician, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But so I'm doing one of my occasional monologues at the moment, but the framing here is this. It seems to me like what might be the case and why there seems to be a very lopsided, it's not balanced. It's not like bad guys on both left and right when it comes to speech. It's now the case that broadly the left is way, way worse. And the right is more like occasionally thuggish for stupid personal reasons, but isn't trying to build an apparatus, like you said. Can that be changed? Was like the 60s like an aberration of the left because they were anti-war and stuff? Because it's like the whole of the credentialed class has bought into this idea that you can't let people just deal with things.
It's sad. Again, I grew up in kind of left-leaning politics. I wouldn't say I was particularly left-leaning, but so one of my heroes growing up was Ira Glasser, who was the head of the ACLU for a long time.
Yeah, Mighty Ira,
right? Intimately involved with the Skokie marching Nazis case. And people forget that the whole idea behind that case was based on the civil rights movement. If we allow this little town in Illinois to deny a permit for Nazis today, right? Tomorrow, you're going to get every southern town with every, Buford, Putzer, mayor, or whatever that, you think. They're going to outlaw the NAACP. They're going to outlaw civil rights marchers. And that's not what this country is about. This country is about letting everybody talk, right? That whole view, as you say, that whole populist concept of speech has died, right? It's been replaced by this new sort of college-bred Wilsonian thing. One of the little noticed facets of both the Twitter files and this entire issue is that the people who do the checking and the reviewing of speech, they are not working class people. They're all college graduates. They're all, or even sort of graduate degree holders. So it's the rich censoring the poor for the most part. And that does not appear to be a concern of today's left. I'm shocked by that, but it's sad, but true.
There's so many other things we could talk about that in a way are more present and pressing. The Epstein files, the wars, all of the wars. We will have you back to talk about those. But this fight feels more essential to our identity as Americans to me. Because whatever wars we're fighting, whatever it is that we're fighting for, that is the question. Like, what should we be fighting for as Americans? And how has this whole effort, this whole grueling thing of the Twitter files and reporting on these issues and standing on the outside of the consensus view on so many topics, including Epstein in a lot of ways, where do you stand on the idea that we could have some shared values? Because that's the hardest part when I hear about what's happened with such a large percentage of very important, influential people that are all in a groupthink. And I've got my own groupthink. I'm just as guilty of that.
We all are. I mean, I don't remember that you particularly ascribe to groupthink, but
we have our teams, we have our people that we're more comfortable with, our ways of thinking that make us more comfortable. Do you think there's a path to some kind of shared vision of being American?
I hope so. I mean, I think one of the things that I had to do as part of this story that was so unusual was that I had to go back and read lots about American history, but also like primary documents about American attitudes towards speech. I needed to understand where all this fit in and whether it was far out of bounds or just a little or whatever. And in the process of doing that, I found myself feeling like intensely proud to have come from this culture, which is not something that was normal for me. Like, I'm not a flag waving type generally, but these ideas are beautiful ideas. They're hopeful. They're in a way like sort of spiritually important. People like Madison and Jefferson, they had tremendous faith in the creativity of the human spirit, the ability of people to behave kindly towards each other and to take in difficult information and to get through crises and to do all these things, to have the foresight to see all this so long ago, and to see that little tiny things like, Madison, for instance, had the opportunity to use the term toleration of religion in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and had the foresight to use the term freedom of religion. And that was a big difference, because toleration means it's conferred by the government, right? Freedom means that it inherently is. We are free people, right? We have free thoughts. We have free beliefs. It was an incredibly profound thing that these guys hit on. And it would be tragic if we lost it because of stupid partisan arguments that we're having right now. So I hope that people come back to appreciating some of these ideas, because when you look at them up close, if you dust it off a little bit and take a look, it's really inspiring.
I asked this of every first-time guest, and that's a perfect segue into this question. The show's called Dad Saves America because I think that's a role we play as men that is very important, not just to our families and for ourselves, but also it ladders up to the country, because we have this influence on our kids, on our community, and then on our country as a result. And I believe in this time where so much is beyond our control, our personal sphere and the people we touch through that, we have control over. We have agency in that. How do you think about your role in the American story?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm a dad. I have 3 young sons. I often think about how clarifying the experience of parenthood is, because it immediately forces you to no longer put yourself at the center of the universe. Every parent will tell you the same thing, that, the instant you hold a child, you realize that you'd willingly die for this little creature, right? And so, my job is so secondary to the job of being a good parent, and I see my role as a journalist as being about telling the truth, and so that I can face my kids, right, at the end of the day. And I know that they're going to read stuff about me. I know they're going to read things about me on the internet when they get older, and that's going to be hard. But I want them to know that I did this for them.
Matt Taibbi, thanks for everything you do. Thanks for coming on Dad Saves America.
Thank you. I'm sorry I got a little emotional there.
It's there's nothing worthy of emotion more than that, my friend. if we can't do it for them, then what the heck are we doing it for, right?
Right, exactly. Exactly. Yep. Excellent. Thanks, John. Appreciate it.